Chapter 1 of Priest on Horseback, Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. Priest on Horseback, Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786, by Eva K. BETZ. Chapter 1 Father Farmer Meets Sebastian. Father Farmer cringed a little as another blast of wind drove bullets of rain into his face, and then on down inside his already drenched clothing. The big gray horse he rode shuddered, and seemed ready to refuse to go farther. The storm, now in its second day, had mired the trail, and travel toward the ferry to New Jersey would have been hard even without today's lashing gale. He tried to shrink a little farther inside his greatcoat and leave less of himself exposed to the weather. "At least no one is likely to be out to shoot me on a day like this," he assured himself with grim humor. "Not that anyone ever has, but you never know." In the early days of the colonies, missionaries like Father Farmer needed to be brave. It helped a good deal if they had a sense of humor, too. He slapped the reins against his horse's neck, not so much to urge him on as to remind the animal that his rider was still there. The horse cantered a pace or two, and then settled back to the steady stride which carried him over seemingly endless miles without exhaustion. The cold, driving rain continued. "And to think how disappointed I was when I learned that I was not to be sent to the China missions," Father Farmer thought. "I was afraid life would be too easy in the colonies. They were settled and developed, with cities and civilization and soft living. Of course, Father Schneider used to be shot at both by Indians and by colonists who did not approve of Catholics. But although we still have no rights in the colony, we are rarely attacked any more." The tired horse stumbled over a hole in the trail, and nearly unseated his dreaming rider. But they got by the dangerous moment and continued their journey. Suddenly the animal pricked up his ears. Father Farmer stiffened, knowing that the horse had heard something he had not. It might be a prowling animal, intent on its own business, not dangerous unless it was annoyed. It might be a human being, less predictable. A lane joining the road brought the answer. Another horseman was riding down to the bend, going in the same direction as Father Farmer. They exchanged greetings. The priest saw a young man with a pleasant face, a face which seemed better suited for a smile than the dejected look it now wore. The sad young man, in turn, saw a slim, wiry man of middle age, with a face so full of kind gentleness that it warmed one just to look at him. "Not a good day for riding," said Father Farmer cheerfully, as they moved together along the trail. "Not a good day for anything," grunted the stranger. "Oh, come now. Every day brings some blessings. This rain—" "You have your opinions. I have mine." It seemed as if the conversation was ended, and accepting the gruff words as a dismissal, Father Farmer was about to hurry ahead. But the stranger reached out a hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "There is no reason why I should vent my disappointment on you." "That's all right," Father Farmer smiled. "When life has treated you badly, it is difficult sometimes not to strike out. Has today been especially bad?" "I've had the greatest disappointment of my life," the young man said vehemently. But he did not seem to want to say any more, and they rode on together in silence. Out of the woods the rain seemed heavier and wetter. Both horses were obviously tiring from the heavy going. The young man suddenly broke the silence. "Have you much farther to ride?" he asked. "Not much. I'm heading for Patrick Colvin's ferry to take me across to New Jersey." "So am I. I hope we can make him hear us over this storm." "He will be watching for us. For me, at any rate," said Father Farmer. "I sent him word that I would be passing through today." As the two men jogged along, the rain slackened and finally died away altogether. Before they reached the ferry landing, a sickly sun was beginning to shine. "Hello, ferryman!" The hail from the priest brought an answer from across the river, and, in an instant, a heavy Durham boat was pulled from its landing by a powerful man. The big gray horse watched it with suspicion, and when the boat reached the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, protested against boarding what he evidently believed to be an unseaworthy craft. but Father Farmer, with the ferryman's assistance, finally got him aboard. "I'll be back," Patrick assured the other man, as he pulled away from the shallows. As the Durham boat tossed a little on the swift running water, the big gray horse snorted and rolled his eyes until the whites showed. "He's not much of a sailor, Father." "He likes the dry land better," agreed Father Farmer. "Do you think it would be all right for me to spend the night with you, Patrick?" he asked, after a moment. "It's quite likely that many of the folk in Trenton know who I am, you realize." "That's true, Father, and they know that Patrick Colvin's a Catholic, too. But they still ride my ferry when they want to go to Philadelphia." "Well, I would certainly like to take advantage of your offer, but each time I do so, I wonder if I'm being fair to you. Governor Bernard's orders forbade." "Oh, those orders are 10 years old. Who minds them now in 1768? The boat reached the wharf, and the men worked to convince the horse that it was not only possible, but necessary, for him to debark. The animal hadn't enjoyed being in the boat, but he seemed to like getting out of it even less. "Will you wait here, Father Farmer, while I go back for the lad, or would you prefer to go over to the house?" "I'll wait," the priest said, smiling, "and we can go together." As the boat pulled away, Father Farmer tethered his horse to a fence and then pulled his register from his pocket. Before he began checking his lists of baptisms and marriages, he turned to the back cover of the book, on which he had written the governor's edict, of which he and Colvin, the ferryman, had spoken. "You are to permit a liberty of conscience," it said, "to all persons, except Papists." "It is interesting," mused the priest, "that in this land established by people seeking freedom of worship, so few people are willing to grant it to others. Oh, well, things are not too bad now. The Jersey laws of the first years of the century would have called me an incendiary and disturber of public peace and safety. I would have been sentenced to life imprisonment. I wonder if I would have been allowed reading matter in jail." For a few moments he amused himself in making mental lists of books to be taken to jail. And when he came back to the world around him, he saw that the ferry had almost completed its trip. It brought back, as passenger, the young man who might have recently heard a life sentence imposed on himself, or have suffered some similar disaster. Gloomily he got out of the boat. Shrouded in sorrow, he helped Colvin make the ferry fast for the night. "Father Farmer, this is Sebastian Haas." Father Farmer knew that since Colvin had given him his title, instead of calling him Mister, the young man must either be a Catholic himself, or at least be well disposed. "Father Farmer? You are English, then?" said Sebastian in surprise. "I thought I heard a foreign accent. Not English, I mean." "Your ears didn't deceive you. I'm not English. I was born in Swabia. But when I was ordained a Jesuit, and knew that I was coming to the colonies, it seemed better to change my name from Steinmeier, my real name, to Farmer." "That's much easier for most people to say," said the priest. "But I thought that 10 years in this land had removed all trace of my foreign birth from my speech, and that I sounded like a native." "Just how does a native sound, Father?" asked Patrick. "A good question. I spent some years in Maryland, and the people there say many words quite differently from you here in New Jersey. While in Philadelphia— But I am delaying you, and you must be tired after your day's work." "Sebastian will spend the night with us," said Colvin, as the 3 men started toward the little house within hailing distance of the ferry wharf. "He comes from Alloway's Creek, near Wisterburg." "That is where I am heading for!" exclaimed Father Farmer. "We can ride over together tomorrow." Sebastian murmured an unenthusiastic assent, and Colvin hastily broke in with an explanation. He was in Philadelphia to meet his sweetheart. "We were to go to St. Joseph's Church to be married," young Haas took up. "Since we were small children we had planned to be married, one day, and our parents were as happy about it as we were. But—" Father Farmer was puzzled. "When the boat from the Netherlands docked, my Greta was aboard all right, but the captain insisted she had paid only half the cost of the passage. Whether it was an honest misunderstanding, or whether the captain saw a chance to make extra money, I don't know. But she had no more money, and I hadn't enough for the balance demanded. So she was sold as a redemptioner to a Philadelphia man." No wonder, Father Farmer thought, that the young man was so sad. They walked in silence until they reached the house. Father Farmer, who had led his horse the short distance, turned the reins over to Patrick Colvin, as did Sebastian. Colvin took the animals to a small shed in the yard. The priest, carrying a bulky package which had been strapped to his saddle, went with Sebastian into the house. 3 years I waited," the young man broke out. "Greta worked and saved to earn her passage money, and studied hard at her English, while my brothers and I prepared a home for her. They are waiting now to welcome their new sister." "The pleasure is only put off for a while," consoled the priest. "She is at least on the same side of the ocean." "But what good is that? She is not with me." "It won't take you long to earn the redemption money, I am sure." "But suppose the man will not accept it? Suppose he insists you work the 5 years? It is his privilege, and anyone who once knew my Greta, she is strong and clever." "Oh, come now, why suppose only unpleasant things? There are kind and good people in the world, you know." The meal was simple but plentiful. Patrick Colvin, because of his agreeability, was able to buy to advantage, and often received gifts of produce and even meat from the farmers he ferried across on their way to Philadelphia. When the supper was over, the 3 men settled down for an evening of talk. Father Farmer turned the conversation to the political unrest in the land. He hoped to distract Sebastian a little from his disappointment. Colvin understood, and began to hold forth on the iniquities of the English. "It would seem that England was just trying to see how long the patience of the colonists would hold out," he said. Sebastian nodded. "I can't understand it," he said. 3 years ago this March they passed the Stamp Act, and found that the hive from which they tried to take the honey was full of angry bees. No official had the courage to enforce that act." Father Farmer chuckled at Sebastian's picture of the seething indignation of the colonists. "So in March the next year they repealed that act, but shortly thereafter passed the Mutiny Act," added Colvin, taking up the tale. "I have a friend who was in New York when the first English troops were landed," put in Father Farmer. "When the people understood that they were supposed to feed and quarter these men, they were furiously angry," my friend said. "What do you think will be the outcome, Father?" asked Patrick Colvin. "The tax which England imposed last year on tea, glass, painters' colours, and so on will stay, so they say, until the colonists comply with the Mutiny Act. And that, if I know them, they will never do." "The King may listen to the petition sent in January by the Massachusetts Assembly," said the priest slowly, "though I am inclined to doubt it. He would be well advised to do so, however. In Boston, which now also has troops quartered on it, the feeling of resentment is strong and growing stronger, I hear. I am afraid there will be bloodshed if the situation continues very much longer." "Is there any talk in Philadelphia, Father, of the colonies breaking away from England and becoming independent?" "If there is, Sebastian, I haven't heard it. I would doubt that it was being seriously considered." A companionable silence settled on the room. It was broken for some time only by the crackle of logs burning in the fireplace. "The hunting and trapping is good near Alloway's Creek." Sebastian seemed unaware that he had spoken aloud, but was evidently part of a thought he had in mind. The 2 older men smiled. "Yes, you can get many good pelts," agreed Patrick Colvin. "It won't be too long before you've raised the money to buy Greta's freedom." Sebastian flushed. "I didn't mean to air my worries. I'll work out my problems. Father," he said, evidently determined to change the subject, "we hear a good deal about some letters published in the Philadelphia newspaper." "Oh, the so-called 'Letters of a Farmer in Pennsylvania.' Masterpieces of reason and reasonableness, all of them." "Who writes them, do you know?" asked Colvin. "Yes. They are the works of John Dickinson, a well-known lawyer in Philadelphia. If his letters can't make the English Parliament see the point of view of the colonists, I don't know what will." "If they don't listen to the reasonable among us," said Sebastian, "I have a feeling that before long they'll be confronted by something more difficult to deal with. The Sons of Liberty are growing quite strong in many places." "France would be pleased, I think," said Patrick Colvin, "if there was a revolt in the colonies. They have not been at all happy since they lost Canada to the English, and are only too eager to have the colonies break away." "I wonder if that would be wise." Father Farmer's voice was grave. "It could not be done, if it were possible, at all, without awful bloodshed. Brother would be turned against brother." "I doubt that it will come to war," said Sebastian. The British know now that in political affairs we will insist on Home Rule, and that we won't tolerate unjust taxes or unconstitutional laws. It will work out, I feel sure." "Let's end on that hopeful note," said Patrick, laughing. "Sun-up will come all too soon, in any event, and if we talk more of the night away—" He broke off with a shrug. "I'll sleep here in front of the fire." Father Farmer's voice was firm, but there was a twinkle in his eye. "I know of old that it's no use arguing with you, Father," said Patrick, "so though I do think it would be more fitting if you took the bed, I'll give you the straw bag as I usually do." "You're growing wiser," approved the priest. "And you, young Sebastian—" "Can share my bed if you'd like," broke in Patrick. "I'll share the floor. Let me go to the barn for straw, and I'll settle down quietly." "As you wish," Patrick agreed. Patrick was already in his bed when Sebastian returned, but Father Farmer was kneeling, his head bowed in prayer. Sebastian knelt for a moment, too, but he was on his straw and asleep before Father Farmer moved. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 2. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 2. Cave In. The morning was clear and lovely as Father Farmer and Sebastian set off on their way to Westerburg. Completely forgotten was the storm of the previous day. In the late March sun it seemed as if they could see the earth working, moving, and stirring under the push of growing things below. There was a definite red to the buds on the maple trees, and the brookside willows were taking on their delicate, lovely spring green. But the promise of the season only served to deepen Sebastian's gloom. "My brothers and I have worked for months to get the house ready for Greta," he explained mournfully. "We have 3 fine rooms and a good attic, and instead of greased paper we have glass in every single window." He paused to let the grandeur of such a place make its impression on his companion. "By next spring perhaps you can have a garden started," suggested Father Farmer. "I have observed that women like to have flowers growing about their homes." "A good idea." Sebastian was enthusiastic. "I don't know why we didn't think of that. Greta is very fond of flowers. I wonder what kind we should have." "You can see what the women at the glass house have. They will be happy, I know, to give you roots and slips from their favorites. That's one thing I've noticed about gardeners. They're always happy to share their treasure." "I'd like to get some blue flowers. Greta's eyes are so blue," said Sebastian. "Offhand, I can't think of many blue flowers," said Father Farmer. "I wonder if you bought some yarrow or Queen Anne's lace in from the fields and watered it with blue water, if the flowers would become blue." "I don't know, but I'll certainly try." "Then she will want an herb garden," went on Father Farmer. "A good wife knows how to make teas and curates from herbs, though Greta may not be familiar with the ones in this country." "She'll learn quickly. My Greta is clever." Planning for Greta's arrival seemed to have cheered Sebastian immensely, so Father Farmer developed the subject, making it last as long as he could. Then the talk drifted to Westerburg and the people there. Since 1739, when Father Schneider had first ridden in from Philadelphia, Mass had been said twice each year at the home of Mr. Lawrence, one of the glass workers. At last they reached Alloway's Creek and the lane to Sebastian's house. A tall, rugged man hailed them. "Sebastian! Hello there! And—" The man suddenly realized that the rider of the second horse was not the expected bride. "What? Where? Who?" For the first time in 2 days Sebastian laughed, though the laughter died quickly. "This is Father Farmer from St. Joseph's in Philadelphia, Jeremiah. Greta is in that city. I'll give you the story when we get to the house." "Father Farmer? Welcome." Jeremiah bowed slightly. "You will stay the night with us, Father?" "Thank you very much, but I cannot. My friend Mr. Lawrence is expecting me. There will be Mass at his house the day after tomorrow, if you would like to come." "Indeed, all 3 of us will be there. It is almost a year since we have had such a chance." "Well, I will see you then." With a wave of his hand, Father Farmer was off. Sebastian dismounted in front of the stable, took off the saddle and bridle, and turned his horse out to graze. Father Farmer followed the course of the Alloway Creek, and soon was in the busy little village of Wisterburg. Surrounded by comfortable homes, the core of the settlement was the glass house, not one building, but the several needed for the production of that precious commodity. Outside the furnace, where the great brown glass pots were heated, a young man was standing. "Good day, Martin," called Father Farmer. "Father Farmer, how good to see you! Mr. Wister told us that we might expect you before long. Will you be with us a few days?" "Yes, I will stay to say Mass the day after tomorrow." "And to baptize John Martin Alder III." "Congratulations. When did he arrive?" "About Christmas time, and a fine boy he is." "That goes without saying," said the priest, laughing. "Don't let me keep you from your work." "Won't you come and see the new bottles we are making? They are, we think, unusually handsome." "All the Worcester glass is handsome. If I won't be in the way, I'd like to see the new forms." Father Farmer dismounted, tethered his horse, and followed Martin Alter into the long, low building where the master glassmakers, brought to this country by Caspar Wister almost 30 years before, were busy at their delicate work. It was very hot, because the sand and soda from which the glass was made had to be heated in great pots until it became liquid. Then it could be worked. Simon Kreismeyer was delicately dipping a long blowpipe into the molten mass. With a skilled turn of his wrist, he wound the crystalline filament around the end of the rod-like pipe until a sizable ball had formed. Quickly and gently he dipped the hot mass into a vat of water near by. "This is the part that always frightens me," murmured Father Farmer. "What if he should breathe in instead of blowing out?" "He never does," said Martin, "and he'd better not. It wouldn't be a pleasant death." Another worker had stepped in front of the glass blower. The second man held what looked like an iron bottle broken cleanly in half. Simon Kreismeyer placed the ball of glass between the two halves, which were then closed firmly together. Simon began to blow gently. It seemed to the watchers to be just one long exhalation. They could not see him breathe in. After a moment he took the blowpipe from his lips and drew it slowly and gently away from the form his helper held. A thin link of glass came with the pipe, glass of a delicate and lovely shade of blue. A third man stepped forward with a big pair of shears and snipped the glass free of the blowpipe. "Another bottle is finished," said Martin. "And I am relieved." Father Farmer sighed gustily. "Do you know what? I held my breath all the time that was going on." The bottle was carried away to the aniline oven, where it would be heated and then cooled, to soften the glass and make it less brittle. "I would like to stay to see more things made," said Father Farmer, "but I think it would be better if I went to let Mr. Lawrence know that I have arrived." He moved out to where his tired horse was standing, but, before he could mount, there was the sound of pounding feet. A white-faced boy leaped the fence and stood below them shaking. "Cave-in!" he gasped. "The sand-pit slid, and my father is caught. I tried to uncover him with my hands, but it only made things worse. Come fast." "Is he buried completely?" asked Martin. "His face was partly out when I left, but now—" End of Chapter 2. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 3. Of Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 3. Rescue. Father Farmer vaulted up on his horse and swung him around to face the direction from which the young man had come. He beckoned the lad to leap up behind him. As he swept past the door of the glass shed, he leaned from his saddle and snatched a long blowpipe from a man who had run to the door when the alarm came. "You direct me to where your father is," the priest said to the frightened boy. "The others will follow as soon as they can saddle their horses and hitch a wagon." There was such assurance in his voice that the boy at once calmed down. Over the fence, across a field, then along a footpath toward some woods. "Watch your eyes!" yelled the boy. This hasn't been cleared for riding, but it's the quickest way." Low branches slapping and slashing at his face had already told Father Farmer that not many horsemen came this way. He hunched his shoulders and ducked his head, but even so his ears, cheeks, and chin were raked. "The sand pits are close by here." Just as the boy spoke they left the woods and came upon a wide field sparsely covered with stiff beach grass. A dune or hillock of the sandy soil was at the far side. From the ground a couple of beams protruded at crazy angles. The boy flung himself from the horse. Father Farmer followed suit, sliding the reins over the horse's head and leaving them dangling to the ground so the animals would think himself tethered. Both ran to where the beams were. "We were shoring up the side of the pit when somehow one of the timbers fell, pinning my father by the legs. His head is near that beam, with the bark still on it." Father Farmer walked lightly and quickly to the place indicated. He could see the head and shoulders of a man lying down flat on the sand. His legs were pinned at the hips by a heavy shoring timber, which had fallen across him, and which itself was now covered by sand. More sand was slowly sliding down onto him. Fortunately, his head was turned and resting on one bent arm. "Father, are you all right?" There was terror in the boy's voice. "Yes. Is help coming, Jacob?" "The men from the glass house will be here in a moment. I brought a stranger with me." "My name is Farmer," said the priest. "I have a blowpipe from the glass house. Suppose we put that near your lips. Then, in case the slide is worse before we get you free, you can breathe easily even if your face is covered." The man on the ground did not answer for a moment. Then he spoke in very weak tones. "See if you can get it near to me without making the slide worse. I can't move my arms to help you, you know. Oh, I hope help comes soon. This weight is crushing me." At Father Farmer's direction, Jacob moved to the far side of the little hill from which sand was being taken. Dropping to all fours to distribute his weight, he crawled up the hill and to the overhang which threatened his father's life. He pulled the blowpipe up to him, and then called to the priest. "Watch and tell me where to place this. I don't dare go near enough to the edge to look down." "Go ahead. I'll call directions." Carefully the boy lowered the blowpipe. "A little more to your left. No, your left." Jacob moved the pipe. It was an awkward, almost impossible task, because the pipe was heavy, and he had only a finger hold on its end. "Farther! Farther!" called Father Farmer. "No, that's too far now. Just a tiny bit back. Ah!" The exclamation of satisfaction came just as Jacob felt a slight pull on the pipe. "It is in finger's reach," said the trap man. "I can steady it down here, but what will keep it upright?" "I'll stay here and hold this end in place," said Jacob. The sound of horses pounding into the open space was a welcome one to the ears of the three men at the sandpit. Father Farmer turned his head for a moment. He looked back just in time to see a little more of the sand slide, probably loosened by the vibration of the earth, set up by the hoofbeats. The head of the imprisoned man was now almost completely covered. Only the blowpipe connected him with the world of the living. The men from the glass house, aware of the danger of a greater slide, left their horses at some distance, and scattering and fanning out as far as possible, converged on the danger spot. "Is Steiner under there?" Martin Alter's voice was tense. "What is that Jacob is holding?" "A blowpipe I snatched as I came. His father can move one hand a little. Enough, anyway, so he can keep the other end at his lips to breathe through." Martin flashed a glance of appreciation at the priest, then hurried over to where the men were working. Richard Wister had deployed his men with the skill of a general before battle. Some were carefully inching in wide planks to make a sort of dry dock to hold back a flood of sand from where the trapped man lay. Others had begun digging near his feet, farthest from the sand bank. They wanted to uncover his legs and get at the timber which was pinning him down. They could not use the spade as it was meant to be used, with a plunge and lift. Rather it had to be more of a scraping, scratching motion. And all the while Jacob Steiner lay on the top of the hillock, arms stretched full length above his head, fingers bloodless, so tight was their grip on the life-giving pipe. Father Farmer was aware that the men were working as an efficient team. that if he were to try to help it would only confuse things. So he remained apart, doing his share by praying fervently. Bit by bit Mr. Steiner's legs were uncovered. It seemed an interminable time, although the men were working with all possible speed. Inch by inch the heavy timber was moved from his hips and at last thrown aside. That accomplished, the men seemed inspired to work even more quickly and skillfully. They worked now from Steiner's head down. As each area was cleared, a plank was slid in to keep the sand from flowing back. At last the sand was all away. Mr. Steiner moved feebly, barely conscious, but alive. Tenderly the men lifted him and carried him to the sand cart, which stood a little distance away. He tried to protest, saying he was able to walk, but they could see he was too weak. "If you hadn't thought so fast," said Jacob, grasping Father Farmer's hand. "I don't know. I can't say." "Go along with your father," said the priest kindly. "I know what is in your heart." Jacob hesitated a moment, then ran to catch up with the wagon, which had now left the field and entered the lane. Father Farmer's part in the drama was over. He could be of no further help, so he did not intrude. He moved towards his horse, mounted, and followed slowly. The Lawrence house was a busy one the following day. The first caller was Mrs. Steiner. "My son has told me that, except for you, I would be a widow today, Father Farmer," she began. "I want to thank you. Now, I know that you are a Catholic priest. It is no secret here. But did you know that my husband is a Lutheran? We all are." Father Farmer smiled. "Should that make a difference when a man's life is in danger?" he asked gently. "How is he today? Better, I hope." "He is in some pain, but very grateful to be alive. I made a poultice of soapwort to heal the cuts he received from the timber. That and the crushed roots of Solomon's seal laid on the bruises will soon have him well again. But I came at his request, and that of my son, to ask how we can repay you." Father Farmer was silent a moment. He knew that it must have been a difficult, possibly even frightening thing for this woman to come and speak to a Catholic priest. The stiffness she showed was not unfriendliness, but lack of assurance in a strange situation. He understood that words of thanks would not content her nor the men of her family. Yet there was certainly nothing he needed that they could give. Then, suddenly, he had an inspiration. "Along Alloway's Creek there are 3 brothers. Hoss is their name." He went on to tell of Sebastian's disappointment in coming back from Philadelphia without his bride. The young man was going to work hard to raise the money to pay Greta's indenture, and, in the meantime, was going to plant a little garden to have ready for her. "I know that soapwort and Solomon's seal both grow wild," he said, "but perhaps you have in your garden some herbs that Greta would like to have, or perhaps a rose bush or some kind of flowers." Mrs. Steiner beamed. "Of course. I will start a root of privet for her. The crushed leaves are good against bleeding, and primroses, a good treatment for any wound. And—" "Young Greta will have a good start, I know," said Father Farmer, laughing, "and I will be in your debt." As he spoke he moved toward the door. "You will give my best wishes to your husband, and tell him he is in my prayers." Mrs. Steiner gulped a little. Then, bravely, she repeated her thanks and said good-bye. It seemed very strange to her to have been talking to a Catholic priest, and liking him too. The rest of the day was a busy one for Father Farmer. Word had spread that he was in the neighborhood, spread more rapidly because of the dramatic incident in which he had played a part. Several young couples who had been married by an exchange of vows before assembled relatives and neighbors now came to have the marriages blessed. 2 or 3 babies who had been born since the priest had come that way were brought in for baptism. The people who came from some distance bedded down wherever there was shelter. They all wanted to attend Mass the following day. It was late before Father Farmer was free to unpack his saddle roll. Now he shook out the vestments and unwrapped the chalice, the altar stone, the hosts, and the small flask of wine. His oils, stole, and breviary had been taken from their case earlier. He was ready for the next day. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 4. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. by Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 4. Shelter for the Night. Richard Wister was not a Catholic, but, like his father who had started the glass works, was always willing that his men enjoy to the full a visit from their priest. He put no pressure on them to hurry back to their work, trusting them not to stay longer than necessary. It was well past midday before Father Farmer had given his last counsel, had heard the last confession, had offered the final word of encouragement. He then packed his box and roll again, ready to be off to the other places he meant to visit. "I have a long trip ahead of me this year," he said to Mr. Lawrence, when the latter urged him to stay another day. "In Germantown I met a Mr. Anthony Brockholst, who owns some iron mines in the northern part of the colony. Most of the men employed there are Catholics, and he was very eager that I go to see them." "Are there good trails way up there?" "I believe so. In fact, part of the way I can use a coach road. I'll manage. God has given me health and a good horse." He smiled. "And now, good-bye. God be with you. If business brings you to Philadelphia at any time, remember that a welcome awaits you at St. Joseph's." Father Farmer slapped his reins against the horse's neck, and was just about to leave the dooryard when a little girl ran up to him, calling timidly, "Mr. Farmer! Wait, Mr. Farmer!" The priest stopped his horse and bent down in his saddle. "Yes, my dear?" "I am Nellie Steiner. It was my papa you saved." "Well, hardly that. There were many of us working together." "Anyway, my mother has baked some journey cakes. They are very nice ones. She said I was to give them to you with thanks." The words poured out in a breathless rush. The child stood on tiptoe handing up the packet of food, and as soon as Father Farmer closed his hand on it, she scuttled away. The priest called his thanks, but he was not sure if she heard him. "I didn't think I looked as if I would eat little girls," he murmured, shaking his head. "I wonder how many years it will be before all this fear and suspicion is gone." The big gray horse, rested and well fed, would have been started off at a gallop had his rider permitted it. But there were days and days of heavy going ahead before he would reach the iron mines in the northern part of the colony. It would be as well to avoid unnecessary speed. The trail which they were following led to Cohansey Bridge, and the wisdom of conserving strength was proved when they reached Bear Creek. The rains of some days before, combined with melting snow, had turned the little rivulet into a menacing flood. Father Farmer brought his horse to a halt and surveyed the situation. Since he wasn't familiar with this trail, he didn't know the stream in its calmer moments. He had no idea where deep water was, could not guess where shallows might offer a possible spot for fording the torrent. The horse, still full of ambition, stood for a few moments, then pawed and snorted gently, urging his rider to get on with it. There was a turbulence a short distance up the stream, which seemed to Father Farmer to indicate the possibility of shallows. He turned his horse and moved toward it, but on arrival he saw that a few jagged rocks were roiling the water. That, certainly, was not the place to try a crossing. The woods were thicker here, and tangled underbrush proved that there was no regular travel upstream. Yet the only possible plan seemed to be to go upstream and try to cross where the stream was narrower. For a short distance away from the trail movement was difficult, though possible. But very quickly the undergrowth became so thick, the vines so matted, that he saw he could not go on. With difficulty he turned his horse and made his way back to the trail. He stood for a moment trying to map out a plan. Directly across the stream from where he was, he could see that the trail continued. This must be the regular fording place. Would it still be safe to try? He decided to risk it, and urged his horse to the water's edge. The horse was balky, wanting no part of the torrent. His rider urged. He hesitated, and then slowly, doubtfully, he put one foot into the rushing water. The footing seemed secure, so he stepped forward with the other foot, lifted it, and put it down again, carefully feeling his way forward. Father Farmer urged the horse ahead, murmuring to him soothingly and slapping him with the reins to encourage him. It would be safer, he felt, if they got the crossing over with quickly. The next step brought the horse suddenly into much deeper water. Immediately the animal started to swim. Fear gripped Father Farmer's heart, not for himself, but for the precious things in his saddle roll. He should have thought to unstrap it and sling it across his shoulders before trying this crossing. There was nothing he could do about it now but hope and pray. The strength of the rushing water carried the horse a little downstream, away from the level spot where the fording was usually made. Here the bank was rather high and very stony. Father Farmer tried to turn the horse's head, to get him to swim upstream to where a landing would be easier, but the horse would have none of that. He wanted to be out of the water, and was going to take the first opportunity to get on dry land, regardless of what ideas his rider might have. One forefoot hit a stone, then the other. The horse clawed and scrambled onto the shore, tearing his way through the bushes, anxious to have the water behind him. He came to a small clearing, stood and shook as a dog might after a swim. "I can sympathize with you," said the priest, laughing, "though I can't say I enjoy your performance. But I'd like to be able to do the same thing, and get the same result." Father Farmer looked about him. He wondered if the cleared space meant that there was a house nearby, or if it was one of the fields cleared by the Indians when they lived in this area. There was no way of telling. The Lenni Lenape, a peaceful tribe, had planted corn and some oats in many fields before they were gathered in their reservation at Brotherton. Sometimes the colonists used the cleared places for planting their own crops. Sometimes, if the land was played out, they built houses and barns on it. And sometimes, if no colonists had settled in the area, the fields were just left open until trees and bushes reclaimed it. Whether or not the field was being used at the moment, Father Farmer decided he had better move across it and try to pick up the trail again. Bear Creek had been cold, and the March wind was even colder. He put his horse to a canter to start the blood circulating in them both. They crossed the field and came to a lane. There was a man standing there, wild and unkempt, but with a certain gentleness in his face. He eyed Father Farmer and then hailed him. "You forded Bear Creek?" "I did." "You had courage. You were the first to try it in 2 days." "It was the courage of ignorance," Father Farmer answered him. "I had no idea whether it was usually a small stream or not." "It is usually a small stream, and when it is in flood it can be a dangerous one." Father Farmer was about to pass on, but the man held up a detaining hand. "You had better not ride far in those wet clothes," he said, "or rheumatism will take its toll. Have you friends nearby? There is no inn." Father Farmer paused. It was not yet mid-afternoon, and he had hoped to cover a good deal of ground before dark. But the man was right, when he warned against riding much farther in wet clothes. "If I could dry out before your fire and give my horse a rub down, I would be grateful. He had a measure of oats this morning, but if I could buy some from you—" "Come to our fire, and welcome," the man insisted. "Stay the night with us, and start off warm and rested, and with your horse fed, tomorrow." Father Farmer accepted the kind offer. The house to which he led consisted of a single large room, with a great fireplace taking up one wall. A fire was blazing, and a woman was busy before it, with pots and kettles swinging from cranes or set on the hearth. "I am Andrew Beacom," said the man, "and this is my wife, Charity." "I am Mr. Farmer from Philadelphia," said Father Farmer. "I came across Bear Creek, or perhaps I should say through it, and both my horse and I were feeling the cold wind on our wet hides." The woman glanced up from her pots, brushed a stray lock of hair from her eyes with the back of her hand, smiled fleetingly, and went back to her cooking. "The boys will be in from the fields soon," explained Mr. Beacom. "They like their supper to be ready when they arrive." Father Farmer went out to the shed where he had left his horse. He took a handful of stiff grass and curried the animal as best he could. Then, taking his saddle roll, he went back to the house. Steam from the kettles now filled the air to such an extent that Father Farmer had the feeling of moving under water. Outlines were vague, distances hard to gauge. He tried to get near the warmth of the fireplace without interfering with Mrs. Beacom's activities, which had now quickened to a frenzy. He found a small stool and pulled it to one side. Then he seated himself and let the heat take over. "I wonder if I'm drier or wetter in all this steam," he mused. Suddenly the door was flung open, and the boys trooped in, 3 young men, each of whom seemed giant-sized in the steamy gloom. "Supper?" asked the first to enter. "Porcupine stew," said their mother, and began a mad dashing back and forth from fireplace to table, ladling bits from various pots into pewter bowls, which she set before each of the young men. "Isaac, Isaac, and Peleg," said Mr. Beacom, by way of introduction. "Come, Mr. Farmer, you have a knife and bowl?" Father Farmer took his utensils from his saddle roll, received his portion from the harried Mrs. Beacom, and sat down at the table with the other men. By the time he and Mr. Beacom had been served, Isaac was ready for a second portion. His brothers and father followed. When the frenzied meal was over, Mrs. Beacom sat down, her bowl on her lap, and had her meal. Father Farmer wondered what would come next. So far, no words had been exchanged since the young men had come in. "Good porcupine, Peleg," said one of the brothers. "And well cooked," volunteered Father Farmer. The 4 men swung their heads in surprise. "Peleg shot it," said Isaac. "And your mother cooked it," said the priest. An amazed silence held the 4 Beacoms for a moment. "Why, so she did. And it was good." The words seemed difficult for Mr. Beacom to say. "It was very good, Mother." Mrs. Beacom looked up from her bowl, bewildered and a little frightened. This was a new situation, and she was not sure how to meet it. "Thank you, Mr. Beacom," she said, blushing like a girl. "I tried to make it good, and it was a nice fat porcupine that Peleg shot. Peleg is a good shot. All my boys are good shots." She seemed anxious to have attention turned from herself. That ended the conversation. "Fire's dying," said Mr. Beacom. "Time to bank it and turn in." He rose, and, taking a small shovel, lifted ashes over the back log to keep the fire smoldering through the night. "It'll keep on giving our heat," Mr. Beacom assured his guest. "You can share the floor with the boys." "You can lie next to the fireplace if you want to," offered Peleg generously. The priest smiled gratefully. "I don't want to take anyone's regular place from him," he said, "but I do like warmth." "Well, just don't roll into the fire," said Isaac. "Nor onto me," added Isaac with a grin. "I won't know if you do bump me," Peleg yawned widely. "Chopping and stripping trees from sunup to sundown sure makes a man sleep well." The 3 young men were asleep almost as soon as they hit the floor. Father Farmer wondered if he might keep a candle going while he read his office, but decided that in circumstances it would not be wise. He lay down, using his blanket roll for a pillow, and for one of the few times in his life, prayed without kneeling. He closed his eyes and drowsed for a while. Then he gradually slipped into sleep. A fearful noise awakened him. He sat up, wondering wildly from what quarter the roar had come. A pale moon shone through the window, and in its weak rays he looked about, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim gloom. The noise came again, and this time he was able to see that it came from Peleg, who was noisily enjoying his hard-earned sleep. Father Farmer lay down again, closed his eyes, and prepared to rest and sleep. The noise which roused him this time was not so deep nor loud as Peleg's snore. It was treble in tone, and even more nerve-fraying in quality. Isaac's whining rasp was soon joined by his brother's deep roar. Father Farmer pulled the end of his blanket roll over his head, but the ends of the blanket, fortunately only the ends, had been wet in Bear Creek, and were not yet entirely dry. When Isaac's whistling snore joined those of his brothers, Father Farmer put his head on the floor under the entire weight of his blanket. But the hard, splintery wood did not make a pillow, even for a circuit-riding priest accustomed to all sorts of discomforts and difficulties. "This is nonsense," he said severely to himself. "I need a night's sleep and must get it. I can certainly ignore what is going on around me." He composed himself, determined to shut his ears to the lusty chorus shaking the air. He slipped into a light sleep, then awoke again, aware of some new assault on his senses. He lay for a moment, half awake, trying to think himself back to his sleep, but uncomfortably conscious of some botheration. His nose told him. A hot, steamy room, 6 persons in it, with 5 of them seemingly not too concerned with bathing. 3 young men sleeping in the clothing they had worn working hard all day, and most likely the night before and the day before that, and the night before that for some time. Father Farmer hoped he was not overly fastidious, but he was sure he could not remain in this room much longer. He did make one more effort to ignore the conditions, but it was evident he would get no sleep here. As quietly as he could, he got up from the floor, slung his blanket roll over his shoulder, and tiptoed out the door. He went to the shed where his horse was stabled. Near the corner was a heap of hay, and into that he crawled, squirming and twisting until he had pressed out a sort of nest for himself. In it he slept. Twilight covered the land when the priest wakened. There was no sign, yet, of stirring life within the house. Father Farmer busied himself currying and grooming his horse, hoping that when the Beacon family awakened they would believe that he had just left the shelter they had so generously offered. "You're up and about early," Isaac greeted him when cock-crow signaled time to be up. "I must make an early start," explained Father Farmer. "My mother's preparing our breakfast. She has counted you in," said Peleg, appearing at the door. "She is most kind, and an excellent cook. You men are fortunate." Somewhat bewildered at this odd point of view, but willing to consider it, the young men ushered Father Farmer into the house, and they all broke fast. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 5. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 5. Someone is in trouble. Father Farmer stayed overnight at Cohansey Bridge. Two young couples who had exchanged marriage vows in front of witnesses came in to have the marriages blessed. One old woman, who was so ill that she did not expect to live till the priest came again, was given all the help possible. A baby was baptized. And then the priest was on the road again, following the old trails to Woodbury and Gloucester and Burlington, then on to Princeton, Hillsborough, Bound Brook. Sometimes he found shelter with well-disposed people, sometimes he spent the night in the open under a tree. After Bound Brook the trails began zigzagging across the colony. He could no longer go north, but must go east to Springfield and Elizabethtown before he could go north again into the hills where the iron mines were. In a pleasant valley near the settlement at Morristown he came to a home where he planned to stop for the night, and where he would say Mass the following morning. Mass here would have to be more or less secret, for his host, Mr. She, was surrounded by neighbors who disliked Catholics, and combined that dislike with a real fear of Jesuits. Since Mr. She had not yet been allowed to buy the land on which he lived, but only to rent it, Father Farmer was unwilling to do anything which might turn his neighbors against him. As he turned up the lane which led to the house, he was startled by a great thumping boom, a noise which sounded almost like the firing of a cannon. For an instant he was confused, but quickly realized that Mrs. She, or one of the indentured men, was pounding corn. The She's, unlike many of the colonists, treated their indentured servants well. Some of the colonists owned slaves, and they were, on the whole, treated well, for they had been purchased as goods, and would remain with their owners for life. But indentured people would be free in a few years, and in all too many cases they were worked to the limit of their strength, and beyond, so that every penny paid for them was returned twice over. At Mr. She's, however, slaves, indentured servants, and family all worked equally hard, all had time to play and to rest, so the corn pounding might be the work of any of the people in the household. The priest rode around to the back of the house. At some distance from the door was the stump of a tree about 3 feet tall. Its centre was hollowed out and smooth. Near by was a sapling, to the top of which a rope was attached, holding a large smooth stone at its free end. This was the pestle. The hollow tree trunk was the mortar in which corn was being pounded into meal. The spring of the tree lifted the heavy stone. The weight of the stone itself helped Mrs. She bring it down on the corn. "Good day," called Father Farmer. "Good day, Mr. Farmer." The priest realized that someone was around on whose understanding or friendliness Mrs. She could not depend. "We are having a log rolling to-day, and our neighbors have come to help," Mrs. She explained. "Perhaps I could help, too," suggested Father Farmer. "Another pair of hands is always useful." A small boy had appeared from the barn, and Father Farmer, after removing the roll containing his vestments and mass kit, turned over the reins of his horse. He carried the roll into the house. Then, following Mrs. Shee's directions, he walked across a cleared field and toward the woods which bordered it. As he neared the place, he could hear the ring of axes and the sound of voices among the trees. He saw that one of the tall trees near him was undercut, so he hastily veered to one side before walking any further into the grove. A dozen or more large trees had been chopped part way through. They stood along a rough lane which led from the field to an open space in the woods. This chopping or undercutting was done on the side of the tree away from the field. A group of men stood looking up at the oldest and biggest tree, and seemed to be trying to decide which way it would fall. "It will go directly into those 2 trees there, as it comes down, and they will take the rest of the row down," said one man. "If we can start the fall right, it will," agreed another. "But I'd like to see a deeper cut made." "We don't need a deeper cut here, but some cutting on the far side would help." Each of the men had his own idea about how the giant should be brought down, tumbling the row one against the other before it. "A strong rope well above the cut." "We'll do no pulling, please, gentlemen." Mr. Shee's voice was one of authority. "Too often people are maimed or killed when that is tried." Mr. Shee noticed Father Farmer for the first time. "Mr. Farmer, have you any suggestions?" "It seemed to me that there was sense in the suggestion that a cut be made on the other side of the tree," said the priest. "I know how to chop, but I don't know much about trees. So I'll make the cut if you'd like, and you gentlemen keep your eyes on the tree and let me know when I must stop." There was a little more discussion, but finally the plan was adopted. The decision was hastened by a small breeze which came through the woods. A wind could throw the tree in the wrong direction and undo all the careful planning. Father Farmer took the axe which Mr. Shee handed him and moved around to the far side of the tree. He eyed the trunk for a moment, gauging the distance from the ground that his cut should be. Then he swung, and chips flew. The men on the other side watched the top branches for the telltale shiver which would indicate the tree's fall. But though all were concentrated on the tree, its fall was sudden and unexpected. One moment it seemed as steady as it had ever been. The next it was leaning, falling. "Run!" The urgent warning came in one voice from half a dozen throats. Father Farmer ran. But the tree which had stood for 60 years crashed down so fast that the long branches caught his coat, and for a moment it seemed as if he would be pulled into the wreckage. But the cloth gave, and he was free. The great tree fell on the 2 trees in front of it, toppling them forward. They, in turn, carried 2 more of the undercut trees, and those 2 more. The air was filled with flying fragments, twigs and bark, and the dust of powdered leaves. Birds flew about in panic, and as the rumbling roar reached distant farms, dogs barked madly, warning their owners of some fearful, noisy danger. The little knot of men stood silent until the bedlam quieted a little. "Half the lane is cleared," said Mr. Shee. But none of the others answered. They were looking curiously, then suspiciously, at a small book which had fallen from Father Farmer's pocket as he leaped to safety. It was his breviary. The men eyed him very gravely. "Thank you all." Mr. Shee seemed unaware of the feeling of tension in the air. "And I thank you," said Father Farmer, calmly reaching out to receive the small book. "I would not want to lose this." "You gentlemen will stop at the house for cider?" asked Mr. Shee. "I will lop the branches and have a log rolling tomorrow." "Thank you, but I had best be getting home," said an older man. "It looks as if a storm might be coming." The others murmured agreement, and before long they had all departed. "Mr. Shee, I am terribly sorry," burst out Father Farmer as the last man left. "That was careless of me." "You couldn't help it," said Mr. Shee. "And anyhow, I don't know that it matters much. Sooner or later, some way or other, it would have come out that I am a Catholic. If, that being so, they do not want me for a neighbor, it is better for me to learn it now than after I have cleared and improved more of the land." The 2 men moved toward the house. "And, Father Farmer, I think they will decide to overlook that fault in my character," he said cheerfully. "So?" "Even now an indentured man is on his way to see me. He was a schoolmaster in Ireland, and I want him to teach my boys to read and write and figure." "And?" And the other men are ambitious for their sons, too. There has never been a schoolmaster in these parts, so I may be able to trade learning for their children in exchange for security for myself." Father Farmer laughed, then sighed deeply. "What a pity that a man cannot be accepted for what he is, that the suspicion and priest hunting of the old world must go on here." "It will pass," said Mr. She. The kitchen was an arena when they reached it, the scene of all the many violent physical efforts needed in preparing a meal. Great loaves of bread made from dried pumpkin meal and corn were being taken from the oven on a broad paddle which weighed almost as much as the woman who managed it. Raw potatoes, still eyed with suspicion by many of the colonists, were being pounded into a gummy mass, mixed with apples in a great iron pot, and moved to the fire where they would simmer into a gluey jelly. But the centre of attention was John She, the eldest son, who was busy in the corner chopping some beef which had been in brine since slaughtering time last November. A large hunk of the beef was in an iron pot, and as John minced it by pounding with the sharpened edge of a shovel, the clang and bang added to the clamour in fine style. Father Farmer leaped with the grace of a dancer as Mrs. She swung around with the steaming loaf of bread. "We will go to the other room," said Mr. She, putting his mouth close to the priest's ear in order to be heard. The She house was a comfortable one of 3 rooms, with an attic overhead. There corn and peppers and apples and pumpkins were hung to dry in the fall, giving out their aromas to the boys who slept there during the winter. In warmer weather both the boys and the indentured men, who used one of the downstairs rooms when it was cold, preferred sleeping in the barn or the fields. The room into which the men went was usually reserved as sleeping quarters for Mr. and Mrs. She. But now the priest's saddle roll was on the bed, and a long piece of snowy linen had been spread on the bureau in preparation for its use as an altar next day. "Father Farmer, is there talk in Philadelphia of the colonies breaking free of England?" asked Mr. She. "There seems to be an uneasiness in Philadelphia and in Boston and New York, a dissatisfaction in many parts of the colonies, but there are no definite plans, as far as I know. The people are not strong enough yet to take action, but England will have to mend her ways or there will be trouble, I think." "What is the sentiment around here?" "These people all love England and do business with her. I think a move toward liberty would get little support from them." "What is your own feeling in the matter?" Mr. She considered for a moment. "I don't want war, certainly, yet liberty is sweet. I think that we could select a ruler from among our own people." "What should his racial background be?" "Irish." "Would the English colonists agree to that?" "I suppose not." "French?" "They think so differently from the rest of us. Swedish, perhaps." "I don't think the Germans would approve." "It will not be easy, I see, but it can be done when the time comes." 3 she boys and their parents, the 2 indentured men, and Father Farmer sat down to a bountiful meal. In contrast to most of the homes he visited, the mother here dined with the rest of them, getting up only when a plate needed replenishing. When the meal had been cleared away, the boys took out a checkerboard and challenged their father. The board was a plank marked off into squares. Alternate squares had been tried with the hot poker. The men were kernels of corn, red kernels being substituted for yellow ones when they reached the king row. Advice was showered on both players during the game. When John beat his father, he said it was in spite of the help he had received, though his father insisted he had lost because of it. "Will you say the rosary, Father?" asked Mrs. She when the game was done. "Gladly," said Father Farmer, pulling his beads from his pocket. Mrs. She put out the candles before they all knelt in the firelit kitchen. She was unaware that many of the neighbors already knew or suspected Father Farmer's identity, although, since the breviary was printed in Latin, it was possible that the men who had seen it were not certain what it was. The priest made the sign of the cross. The others followed. "I believe in God," Father Farmer began. There was a heavy knock, quietly repeated at the door. "Who can it be this time of night?" said Mrs. She, getting up from her knees. "Someone is in trouble outside." "Or inside," said Father Farmer under his breath. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 6. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. by Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 6. The Good Samaritan. Mrs. She opened the door. "Good evening, Mrs. She. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wonder if— could I talk with— is Mr. Farmer about?" "Good evening, Mr. Van Art." Mrs. She hesitated, worried, not knowing what answers to make to the question. Mr. Van Art owned the land the Shees were farming. He would sell it to them, as was the custom, only if he approved of them. Before she could make up her mind what to answer, Father Farmer moved across the gloom of the kitchen. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes, Mr. Farmer. I wondered if by chance you were a doctor. The little book you dropped today. I am no scholar, but I knew the words to be in Latin." "So?" Father Farmer was noncommittal. "I knew that doctors often study Latin, and I hoped. I know something of medicine, Mr. Van Art. Are you in trouble?" "Yes, Mr. Farmer. My son, my only child. Oh, if you think you can be of any help, do come quickly." "I'll saddle my horse." "It won't be necessary. I brought an extra horse in the hope that I would find help here." Father Farmer hurried to get his coat. "What has happened to the boy?" he asked as he shrugged into the heavy garment. "He has a little tossy ball which he prizes highly, and today, when he was playing with it near the stream, where he has been told not to go, it fell in." The men had mounted their horses by now. Father Farmer did not try to guide his mount, but left it free to follow Mr. Van Art, who rode ahead. "The lad went into the water after it?" the priest asked. "Yes, and since he has been disobedient in going near the stream in the first place, he told no one what had happened. The lad stayed in his wet clothes all afternoon, and a wind came up, as you remember." Mr. Van Art paused. "Didn't the lad's mother notice his condition?" "His mother is dead, Mr. Farmer. I have a housekeeper who tries, but there is a great deal to be done, and of course she isn't the lad's mother." Father Farmer murmured sympathetically. "And then tonight when I went to his bed to say good night, I found him burning with fever. He was hardly able to breathe, so great was the congestion in his lungs. I didn't know what to do, and neither did the housekeeper. Then I remembered the Latin book, and rode over in the hope that you could help me." "I will do what I can, Mr. Van Art. Oh, have you a gun with you?" "A gun? No. Why?" "I saw a skunk in the bypath there, and we could use the skunk grease very well to break up the congestion in your boy's lungs. But we'll manage without." They had turned from the road toward a house, now, and a man ran out as they neared the barn. Mr. Van Art dismounted and hurried toward the door of the house. Father Farmer quickly followed. "Is that my father?" croaked a small boy. "I want to see my father as soon as he comes. I am so hot, and he will know how to make me feel cool." Father Farmer went to the bed where the young patient lay and examined him carefully. "I think he has pleurisy," the priest said. "Do you have violets growing hereabouts?" "Why, yes. My wife planted them near the doorway, and they have spread out a great deal." "Are they in bloom?" "Strangely enough, yes. It is early for them, but—" "Tell your man to take the lantern and gather as many of the blooms as he can find. Oil of violets is best, but we have no time to make a decoction. Oh, and have your man bring some of the leaves, too." Mr. Van Art issued the orders and at once went back to his son. The priest took off his coat. He got a cloth from the housekeeper and a basin of cold water, and sponged the boy's burning forehead. "It feels good," said the boy. The priest dipped the cloth again, wrung it dry, and then twirled it around in the air for a moment. "It will feel much cooler," he explained to the surprised Mr. Van Art. He laid the cloth on the boy's head again. Then he turned to the violets which had been brought in, and busied himself stripping the blooms from the stalks. He put the flowers in the pewter bowl, and pounded them with a small pestle supplied by the housekeeper. "Have you some wine?" he asked. "No, I do not have a bit," said Mr. Van Art. "Well, then, I'll use water, although the wine would be better." He dripped water slowly into the bowl with the mashed flowers, until there was a purplish, pasty mass. "The leaves are good as a poultice, so we will try that too." He turned to the housekeeper. "You can make a poultice of the leaves. Do not get it too hot, nor too cool either, and lay it on the lad's chest." The housekeeper, who had been silently blaming herself for the boy's illness, was happy to be allowed to do something for him. The kitchen door opened, and the handy man entered with more violets. These he had picked without the stems. "Good man. You are observant, I see. Keep them coming in." "I heard you ask for wine," the man said hesitantly. "I have a small bottle of claret that It was given—" "We won't ask where it came from," broke in Father Farmer, taking pity on the man's confusion, "if you are willing to sacrifice it." "I'd give anything I have to Benjamin," the man said, and disappeared to his own quarters. In a moment he was back again, carrying a small flask, which he gave to the priest. Father Farmer dripped it into the bowl as he had the water, using only enough to moisten the contents. He gave the mixture to Mr. Van Art, who filled a spoon with it once again. "Must I take more?" The boy had finished all the 3 or 4 spoonfuls of the first batch, protesting a little each time. As he asked the question again, it seemed to the priest that his voice was already a little clearer. But it was very soon, he was afraid, to see results, so he decided that the seeming recovery was only wishful thinking on his part. The workman came in again, his hands filled. "This is the end of them," he whispered. "We'll get 2 good spoonfuls out of this," Father Farmer said. "That should take us through the night. We may need more tomorrow." "I'll find them if you need them." The housekeeper changed the poultice, and Father Farmer took the now hot cloth from the boy's forehead. He wet and wrung it and swung it violently, then put it back on the boy's forehead. "We 2 will sit here if you want to send the others to bed," he said to Mr. Van Art. "They have a day's work to do tomorrow." "And you?" "My work is here." The housekeeper put the candles into savealls, little wire frames with pins, which held the candle at the base, and so permitted it to burn to the very end. She laid out 3 more to be ready in case they were needed, and then went to bed. The 2 men sat in silence for a while. "He seems to me to be breathing a little easier," whispered Mr. Van Art. "Give him another spoonful of the violets," the priest directed. The boy swallowed the dose sleepily and without protest. "He's all right?" Mr. Van Art was suddenly frightened. "He's not—" "The violets have loosened the congestion, the violets in the poultice. And the wine, little though it is, helps make him sleepy. He's doing very well, I think." The banked fire cracked a little under its night blanket of ash. Slowly Father Farmer drew his breviary from his pocket. "Your medicine book?" asked Mr. Van Art. "Of sorts." The priest smiled and began to read his office. He did not know just how long he had been reading when he became aware that Mr. Van Art was feeling the cloth on his son's forehead. "Change it?" he asked. The priest nodded and watched with approval as all the right steps were taken. "See if you can get him to take some of the violets," he said. "It must be 2 hours since the last dose." Benjamin was very sleepy, but did manage to swallow. "Shall I use the hourglass?" asked Mr. Van Art. "Yes, in 3 hours he can have some more." Silence settled on the room again, broken only occasionally by the rustle of paper as the priest turned the pages of his book. "Are you a doctor?" Mr. Van Art asked suddenly. "Why do you ask?" Father Farmer parried. "I have not seen many doctors in my life," Mr. Van Art said, "but all I have met were full of big words and importance." "And I?" "You are simple and kind and neighborly, I suppose is the word I want." "Like the Good Samaritan?" "You know the Bible." Mr. Van Art was eager. "You can't be a doctor. They know only their own books." "You have been unfortunate if the doctors you have met were not Christian." "Oh, excuse me, I did not mean to imply—" "You haven't hurt me, my friend. But you should not be so quick to decide against a man or to think poorly of him." The sand ran noiselessly through the glass. Mr. Van Art turned it, and the second hour started running past. "I sent to England for a clock for my wife, but before it came time had ended for her." Mr. Van Art spoke slowly. "Isn't it strange that the violets she planted are curing Benjamin? He is getting better, isn't he?" "He seems to me to be resting very comfortably." The priest got up and felt the boy's forehead. "The fever is almost gone. This cloth is still cool." While he was up he made a fresh poultice for the boy's chest, and, though the cloth was little heated, he freshened it. Then he went back to his chair, sat down, and closed his eyes to rest them. It had been a long day. "Could I give you some mulled cider, Mr. Farmer?" asked Mr. Van Art. "It won't take a minute to heat the poker." "Do you know the hour?" Mr. Van Art looked puzzled. "It's not 3 hours yet. You said he should have another dose in 3 hours, and the glasses are in only once and a half again." "That's right. It must be a little past midnight. No, I won't have your cider, thank you, but you should have some yourself. This has been a strain on you." Mr. Van Art raked away the ashes until he had exposed some glowing coals. Into these he thrust the poker, which, when it was thoroughly hot, he plunged into the mug of cider standing near at hand. "You really won't have some?" he asked. The priest smilingly shook his head. The sand in the hourglass ran through a second time. The glass was turned. The sand ran through again. "He seems to be sleeping so comfortably that we won't disturb him for this dose," said Father Farmer. Again silence shut down on the room. Each man was busy with his own thoughts. "You spoke?" "I was speaking to God, praying," said the priest. "I wanted to thank Him for using me to help your son." Mr. Van Art looked startled. "My wife used to talk that way, as if she and God were friends." "And aren't you friends with Him?" "I'm afraid I don't think of Him one way or the other," said Mr. Van Art. Although it was still dark, someplace in the distance a cock crowed his warning that day would soon come. Birds here and there began to twitter and try out a few notes of song, rather as if they were singing in their sleep. Young Benjamin stirred and muttered, but did not wake. The candles guttered out, but Mr. Van Art did not replace them, for a cool grey light was seeping in through the windows. Father Farmer read his office, and Mr. Van Art watched him with speculative eyes. He seemed intent on solving a problem or coming to a decision. The housekeeper came in to start her day. Finding the men sitting silent, she went over to Benjamin. When she did not hear the difficult breathing which had pained him the night before, she became frightened. "Oh, no!" she cried. "He's not—" "I'm hungry," said Benjamin, opening his heavy-lidded eyes. "Is no one going to give me some breakfast?" "Thank God," sobbed the housekeeper. "Thank God," echoed Mr. Van Art. "You think of him sometimes, I see," said Father Farmer with a smile. "Keep the lad in bed today, if you can. He will need the rest after fighting down that fever and congestion. He's not entirely well yet, of course. Just much better." The priest rose and started toward the door. "I'll walk back to She's now," he said. "You must breakfast with us, and then ride on one of my horses back if you must go," said Mr. Van Art. "No, thank you, nothing to eat." "I'll eat his and mine, too," offered Benjamin, struggling to get out of bed. "You stay where you are, boy, until I tell you to get up," said Mr. Van Art. "When will that be?" "Tomorrow, perhaps." "Tomorrow!" From the anguish in Benjamin's voice, one would have thought he had been sentenced to a year in prison. Father Farmer smiled. "A day is forever at that age." As he opened the door, a boy rode into the yard. "I've brought a horse for you, Mr. Farmer," he said, "and Mother wants to know how Benjamin is, Mr. Van Art." "Very much better. Almost well, thanks to the knowledge and skill of this kind man." "And the goodness of God," Father Farmer added firmly. "I have brought a top I carved," said the boy, holding out the toy. "I thought Benjamin might like to play with it if he has to stay in the house. And my brother sent the jumping jack Father made for him." Mr. Van Art's eyes were moist as he took the toys. "Benjamin will enjoy them and take good care of them," he said. "But he mustn't worry if something breaks. I know that accidents do happen with children," said the 10-year-old. Mr. Van Art turned to the priest. "How can I repay you for your kindness?" he asked. "I am so helpless when the boy is sick." "I am sure Mrs. She will always be glad to help you," answered Father Farmer. "There should be no talk of repayment for a simple kindness. But is there nothing I could do for you? Nothing you want?" Father Farmer was about to speak, stopped, considered, and then came to a decision. "I think you may have suspected," he said. that I am a minister to souls rather than to bodies. It could be that the idea is offensive to you. But on the other hand, you may have learned something of brotherhood in Christ. You may have learned that not all people of my persuasion, shall we say, are evil and dangerous." He paused and looked fixedly at Mr. Van Art. "The Shees are my friend. It would make me very happy if they were allowed to buy the land they farm." "But if they are, my neighbours will not be happy if I permit—" "You must follow your conscience," said the priest. He mounted his horse and rode from the house. The bureau altar was ready, covered with a white cloth and decorated with field flowers and grasses. Pewter candlesticks stood ready to receive the altar candles, and Mr. She, in the suit reserved for very special occasions, was waiting to serve Mass. "To think that God Himself is coming down from heaven to our home," murmured Mrs. She. She drew a kerchief over her head and knelt in a corner of the room. "I will go into the altar of God," began the priest. "To God the joy of my youth," answered Mr. She. The Mass over, Father Farmer packed his saddle roll, had breakfast with the family, and mounted his horse. "Oh, by the way," he said to Mr. She, who stood at the animal's head, "Mr. Van Art is a good man and a just one. Perhaps Mrs. She can help him look after Benjamin, because, despite your Catholicism, I have a feeling you will be allowed to buy this place." End of Chapter 6. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 7. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 7. Face Things as They Are. When Sebastian's fiancée, Greta, entered the Bridge household in Philadelphia, Mrs. Bridge at once decided that she must be trained to work in the house itself rather than the dairy. Her quick mind and pretty manners made it pleasant to have her around, and the childless Mrs. Bridge always enjoyed having a young girl near her. Greta was not too happy about it, because she found her employers brusque and cold. This particular day she was bringing tea into the drawing-room for her employers and their guests, Mr. and Mrs. Charles. "Mr. George Washington is a planter," Mr. Bridge was saying as Greta entered the room. "He lives at a place called Mount Vernon." "He is the one who drew the plans for the Non-Importation League?" asked Mr. Charles. "He and a neighbor, George Mason, are largely responsible for pushing it, at any rate." "It makes trade with England very difficult," sighed Mr. Charles. Mr. Bridge eyed his guest sternly. "Oh, I conform to all the rulings," Mr. Charles hastily assured his host. "With every order for goods of any kind, I send a note saying that if a tax is laid on any of the materials, I will refuse the shipment." He paused. "But it does make things difficult." Mr. Bridge smiled. "Things may become even more difficult, my friend," he said, "if it comes to a point." "Greta, we are waiting." Mrs. Bridge's voice was sharp. That was the trouble. Just when a conversation got to be interesting, Greta had to stop listening and go elsewhere. Our little conveniences, when measured against our liberty, should have no value. Mr. Bridge's voice followed her down the room to where the two wives had been discussing clothes. Liberty. The word was at once both sweet and bitter to Greta. She placed the tea tray on a small table near Mrs. Bridge. "You take sugar?" Mrs. Bridge poised her saw-toothed scissors over the untouched loaf. "No, not always, and perhaps you had better keep that loaf intact. If these silly men have their way, goodness knows when we will get any more, or any more tea. Or frocks or bonnets. Merchants in Philadelphia, Annapolis, New York, Boston, all the seaports are being very unpleasant about those taxes. Mercy! It's only a few pence. Why do they fuss so?" "My brother in England writes most pitifully," said Mrs. Charles. "He tells me that merchants and manufacturers will be put out of business if this non-importation fad is carried on much longer. We hear that there are mobs in the London streets who seem equally angry because they have no food, and because they say human rights and liberty are being interfered with. "Rights!" snorted Mrs. Charles. "What rights do they have?" Greta was glad that her duties in the drawing room were done. The two conversations, the one between the men and the one between the women, both disturbed her. It embarrassed her, too, having Mrs. Bridge and her guest talking as if she, Greta, were deaf. She was worried by the talk between the men, talk which almost sounded as if they were going to defy England, even to break away from her. Surely that would mean war, and Sebastian would have to fight. Greta sighed as she went upstairs with some laundry. There had not always been enough to eat in her home in Holland, and often they were cold. But it was a happier place than this, she thought. Having neither money nor luxuries, her parents had never had to fret about losing them. She had finished her duties upstairs, and was just coming down when there came a loud rap at the front door. She opened it, and a tall man brushed past her with a hasty, "I will see Mr. Bridge." He strode into the dining room. "Mrs. Bridge? Mrs. Charles?" He bowed to the ladies as he greeted them, but seemed to begrudge the time needed for even that brief courtesy. "Ira, a ship is leaving at daybreak. I just learned of it. Mr. Wister has arranged with one of those priests at St. Joseph's Church to have some workmen from Swabia come on the ship's return voyage. I know you were wanting some workers for your tannery. If you send word quickly to Mr. Harding, the other one, Mr. Farmer, is off on business. If you tell Mr. Harding your wants, he may arrange with the captain to bring some indentures for you. Confound it, I have an appointment with—" He stopped suddenly. "You, girl, I forgot your name." "Greta, sir." "I knew it was something outlandish. Greta, do you know where St. Joseph's Church is?" Greta's heart leaped. She knew well where it was, and longed to go there, but she had been afraid to ask the Bridges to give her the free time. She was certain they would refuse. It was, indeed, where Sebastian had said they would be married. "I know it, sir." "Get your bonnet and shawl. I'll write a note to this Mr. Harding, and you will take it down to him." "Mind you walk briskly, and don't waste any time," put in Mrs. Bridge. "There must be no loitering, either going or coming." "Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am." Greta wasn't quite sure which answer was correct, so she gave both. Then she flew from the room, up to the little windowless attic where she slept, and was back, ready to go, before Mr. Bridge had sanded the ink on his letter. The evening had that cool, fresh-washed feeling that seems to come only in April, and Greta gulped in the air with delight. In the weeks that had passed since the dreadful time when she had parted from Sebastian at the boat, this was the first time she had been alone out of doors, and she savored it. The tree-lined streets enchanted her, and her eyes widened as a coach dashed past. It was a famous flying machine. Someone had told her that it went regularly between Philadelphia and New York, and made the trip from one city to the other in only 2 days. "It can't be safe to travel at such speed," she thought, "and certainly it cannot be comfortable." She wondered if the coach on its journey passed near Sebastian's house, the house which had been enlarged and beautified for her arrival. She tried to picture it in her mind's eye, but found it difficult because houses in this country were so different from those at home. The mental picture she made wavered between a castle she had seen in her childhood and the little house in which she had grown up. "What with this expanding and contracting of Sebastian's house, I'll grow dizzy," she laughed at herself. She realized that her steps had slowed while she dreamed so. She hurried a little. "I'd better turn here." Down the street on which she now walked, she saw the little Gothic chapel which served the Catholics of Philadelphia. Attached to it was a tiny building in which the two priests had their quarters. She was about to knock at the door of this little house when someone spoke from behind her. "You want to see me?" A short, pleasant-looking man came from behind the church building. From the caked mud on his boots and on his hands, it was evident he'd been working in the vegetable patch visible behind the church. "You wanted to see me?" he repeated. "Yes. You are Father Harding?" "I am. If you will excuse me while I wash some of this earth from my hands." The priest walked over to a rain barrel which stood at the corner of the smaller building. He took a gourd, which was attached to the wall by a long cord, ladled out some of the rain water into a small basin, and rinsed and rubbed his hands. He glanced about and, as nothing else was available, used the grass for a towel. "Now, I am to some extent clean. We can talk in the church." "I have come only to deliver a note, Father Harding. I am indentured to Mr. Bridge." "I thought you were not one of my flock. It is not so large that I do not notice new faces," said Father Harding. "I should be. I would like to be," stammered Greta. Then, without intending any such thing, she suddenly found herself pouring out all her troubles and disappointments to the sympathetic priest. "So instead of being married to Sebastian, here I am, an indentured girl living with such unpleasant people. I'm not even able to have the comfort of going to Mass." "You must face things as they are," said the priest. "You have surely had a great disappointment, but you must not let it make you unfair. Have you asked if you might go to Mass on Sunday?" "No, I didn't, Father, because I'm sure they wouldn't let me go." "You have come to a decision with no reason behind it. I am equally sure, with reason, that if you ask for permission, and arrange your work so it is not scamped or neglected, you will be permitted to come." Greta sat silent, twisting her fingers in her lap. "I know Mr. and Mrs. Bridge," went on the priest. "They are thoughtless, perhaps, and Mr. Bridge is gruff of speech, but they are kind and honest. You will have opportunities to learn much about the arts of housewifery," he said gently as he got up. "The kinds of food available here and the way of preparing them are very different to what you have been used to. You will be much better prepared to be a mistress of a house after these years of schooling, if you make good use of your opportunity." He reread the letter Greta had brought. "Tell Mr. Bridge that I will speak with the captain about bringing the Redemptioners he wants." Together they walked along the path in front of the church. "I will go to see the captain now," said Father Harding. "And remember all I have said to you. Make use of your opportunities, and do not be resentful towards life. And who knows, something might happen to bring your marriage nearer." Greta would have liked to ask for an explanation of that last sentence, but Father Harding was hurrying in the other direction. It would be well if she hurried too. She must have talked longer than she realized, for the evening was about over, and, unless she ran, she would not be home before dark came. On evenings when there were parties, great torches burned in front of the house where the entertaining was going on. But there were no parties to-night, so no torches flared. In a few minutes the streets would be utterly completely black, and that idea didn't appeal to her at all. She walked as rapidly as she could, breaking into a little run now and then. Suddenly it seemed to her that she was being followed. She hurried and wondered if it was only the pounding of her own head that she heard. No, there was definitely a shush shush in the dust of the lane behind her. It sounded more like the pad of an animal than the step of a person, but the rope-soled shoes of a seaman might sound like that, she realized. "Oh, come, Greta," she scolded herself. "You're imagining things." She forced herself to walk more slowly, though she didn't dare turn around. The sound slowed, too. She felt a slight tug on her skirt. Then it was an animal. Perhaps a catamount had wandered in from the woods near the city. With a tremendous effort of will she made herself keep walking. She could see the house now, the place which until this evening had seemed like a prison to her. At this moment it was a dear and desired haven, with candle-lit windows. If she could get into the light, perhaps she would be safe. Wild animals didn't like light. Mechanically she went on. Was she near enough so that if she called for help someone would hear her? But no, she must not shout. The loud noise might startle the thing into pouncing. She had seen cats play with captured mice before killing them. She tried not to think of it, now that she might be cast in the role of mouse. She walked through a clump of grass on the path. The tug on her skirt was stronger. The moon, hidden until now by clouds, suddenly shone down, throwing black shadows which somehow seemed to be threatening. A few yards from the house she felt a slight prick on her leg. It was not a bad pain. It was just what might be the result of the first tentative probing of a cat's claws. "This is the end," she decided. Then suddenly she became angry. "If I'm going to die, at least I'll see what kills me," she determined. Tensing herself, she turned. She stood for a moment, blank and puzzled. There was no one behind her. No person, no animal. Yet the following noise had stopped only when she stopped, and there was still the pull on her skirt. It took more courage than she would have thought she possessed to reach down and take the hem of her skirt in her hand. She gasped as she felt a sting, or bite, or prick. Prick! That was it! Someone had been pruning rose bushes, and a discarded branch had caught in her skirt. As it dragged along behind her, it quite naturally hurried when she hurried, slowed when she slowed. "Face things as they are," whispered Greta, repeating Father Harding's words. "Maybe facing things makes them not quite so bad." "You're late," said Mrs. Bridge, as she entered the house. "Yes, ma'am, "You gave Mr. Harding the note?" asked Mr. Bridge. "Yes, sir. He went at once to see the Captain, and told me to say he would ask him to bring the redemptioners. I am sorry I took so long. Well, get to bed now. I was worried about you." Mrs. Bridge's voice was sharp, but the words were kind. "Yes, you. I forget your name. If I send you on an errand late in the day again, take a lantern boy with you," barked Mr. Bridge. "Well, they are kind!" exclaimed Greta as she climbed the attic stairs. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 8. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 8. Greta makes a decision. Determined now to "face things as they are," Greta found life much easier. She was still not pleased at being an indentured girl in Philadelphia, when she had expected to be a housewife in New Jersey. But that was the way things were. She was indentured, she was in Philadelphia, and likely to be there for some time. So, as Father Harding had suggested, she would learn all she could. She was busy one April morning, carefully picking apart the covering which had been removed from the chairs in the drawing-room. New material had been bought, and one of the indentured men, who had been an upholsterer in his old country, was busy recovering the chairs. The old material was of fine quality, and Mrs. Bridge had directed that it be ravelled and the thread wound on bobbins. "It will make material for a handsome gown, Greta," she said. "You must learn never to waste anything. Use it up, wear it out. Make it do without. That is an excellent motto for a housewife." "If I had as much money as she has, I'd buy new cloth for my gowns instead of using up old chair seats," thought Greta irritably. She disliked the task, found it foolish and tedious, and went at it with very bad grace. The result was that she kept breaking the threads and having to splice them. Once again Father Harding's words came to her rescue. "Face things as they are." It was her task, she reminded herself, to ravel the cloth and wind the thread on bobbins. If she went at it with a little more calm and serenity, she wouldn't break the threads so often. Doing the task properly would really be easier in the end. She drew a deep breath, settled herself more comfortably in the chair, and soon the bobbins were filled nicely. I see you've learned something." Mrs. Bridge's voice broke a long silence. "Ma'am?" "You didn't like the task I set you, so you did it badly. But you learned that it was certainly harder to do a thing wrong than right. Many a housewife's tasks are boring if she lets them be so." Greta picked away in silence, finding pleasure in getting longer and longer unbroken threads. The cloth was really a lovely shade, something like the color of wild roses. Woven in stripes with white or deep blue, it would make a lovely gown. Perhaps some day Sebastian would buy just such cloth for a gown for her. "Greta, go to the dairy for a pitcher of buttermilk. I think I will drink some." Few of the colonists made butter, and those who did used the buttermilk in other ways, either fattened special pigs with it or sold it to ladies of quality to smooth on their faces as a beauty preparation. But as Greta had already learned, at the Bridges' house many things were done differently. She carefully laid down the cloth she was ravelling, draping the thread over a chair back so it would not tangle or break. Then she hurried out to find Selma, the dairymaid. Selma and John Ridley, both indentured, were talking together. Greta had not waited to put on the wooden pattens usually worn outdoors, and her cloth-soled shoes made no noise. So although she had no intention of sneaking up on them, she was almost beside Selma and John before they were aware of her. They sprang apart, fright and anger on both faces. "Oh, Miss Too Good for the rest of us! I suppose you came spying. Well, how do you like it?" I never said I was. Like what?" Poor Greta was completely confused by the unexpected attack. "Like you heard, of course." "But I heard nothing." "Oh, no, you heard nothing. You didn't hear me telling John my plan to—" "Gently, Selma," John broke in. "She may be telling the truth. Did you really hear nothing, Greta?" "Honestly, I didn't realize that without my patents you couldn't hear me. I had no desire to find out any secrets." "Then what are you doing here? You don't work in the dairy. Nor will I much longer." The last was whispered so low that Greta was not sure she heard it. "I came for a pitcher of buttermilk for Mrs. Bridge. And, honestly, please believe me, I heard nothing of what you were saying." Selma studied her face for a moment. It was an innocent, honest, and, at the moment, a deeply distressed young face. "Give me the pitcher," she said at last, "and I'll fill it, though why any one should want to drink this nasty stuff, I can't imagine. When I'm married—" She stopped suddenly. "Greta, are you going to be married?" she asked. "That is why I came to this country," said Greta, her eyes filling with tears. Then she briefly outlined her story. Selma remained silent a moment. Then she looked questioningly at John. He simply shrugged, turned, and left the dairy. "I'm going to tell you my secret, Greta, but you must swear not to tell any one," said Selma at last. "You mustn't feel you have to tell me. And suppose somebody asks me about whatever the secret is. I wouldn't lie, Selma. I couldn't do that." "Perhaps no one will have a chance to ask you. Perhaps you won't be here. Perhaps you'll be in New Jersey with your Sebastian." "With Sebastian!" Greta's face was bright with joy. "How could that be?" "It can be arranged. But don't glow like that. You'll give everything away. Look glum, or at least solemn." "But to see Sebastian!" Greta gulped. "You're teasing me, and I don't think that's kind. I'm indentured for 5 years." "And I for 7. But I won't be here. I won't be here 7 more days, nor much more than 7 hours. And you need not be either." "But—" "Be still and listen. You can't stay here much longer, or Mrs. Bridge will be out looking for you. Now pay attention. Tomorrow morning, about an hour before dawn, we will slip out of the house." "We couldn't run far. We would soon be caught." "Ye won't run any place. Robert Haver, the man I am going to marry, will be behind that clump of trees, mounted on a good fast horse he has borrowed. He works at the cedar mines in New Jersey, and has a place, a little house, ready for me. I am sure his horse can carry 3, or at least to the ferry. Once across the Delaware, you will have time, and can make your way to—" "Sebastian! But I don't even know exactly where he lives. And anyway, won't the ferryman—" "Not Patrick. He asks no questions and answers few." "But, Selma—" "Don't waste time with buts. Take the pitcher and get into the house. And don't go to sleep tonight. We can't wait for you if you're not ready, you know." Greta took the pitcher and hurried in with it. Her mind was in a turmoil as she filled the pewter mug. "You may take some, Greta," said Mrs. Bridge, accepting the mug. "No, thank you, ma'am." Greta set to work again, ravelling the cloth and winding the thread. Her fingers knew their duty now, so her mind could drift. But somehow, as she thought, she seemed to dwell less on Sebastian and more on the day she landed. The captain of her ship had been so unpleasant. She had been terrified. Then Mr. Bridge stepped up, paid her fare, took her to his home. It would be wrong, surely, to repay his kindness by running away. Sebastian was honest. Would he welcome her if she ran away from here and went to him? Could she run away? Would she ever be happy if she did? Mr. Bridge had paid her passage. She owed him for it, and must work it out. She knew that she must stay, and having come to that decision, felt relieved. The next morning started as usual. It was nearly 7 before any one discovered that someone was missing. "Have notices printed," ordered Mr. Bridge, "and put in the Gazette. Offer $5 reward. Ungrateful girl." There were whisperings in corners, consultations on the stairs. The other indentured servants were annoyed because Selma's escape would make things difficult for them, both because others would have to do her work, and because they would be watched very closely from now on. Fortunately, no one asked Greta if she knew anything about Selma. As the days passed, she tried to put all ideas of running away to join Sebastian out of her head. She repeated to herself that Mr. Bridge had paid her passage, or what the Captain had demanded for her passage, for she was sure that she paid the bill in full before she left Europe. But the fact remained that the Captain had demanded more, and that Mr. Bridge had paid it, and so had bought her time for 5 years. It would be cheating him to run away, and most ungrateful too. She had a good home, a warm room and enough food, and, now that she had become accustomed to their abrupt, almost gruff manner of speech, she knew that she was living with people who were kind at heart and interested in her welfare. So she determined to follow Harding's advice and be a good servant, to learn all she could in preparation for the time when she would be mistress of her own home. "This morning, Greta, we will start hatcheling the flax. It has been well beetled, so it will be nice to handle." "Beetled?" Greta was startled, and began searching the bundles of flax for insects. "Yes, of course, beetled, or perhaps you call it by another name." "I wouldn't know what I call it, if anything, because I don't know what it is," answered Greta. "When we want especially fine flax, we have it put in a trowel and pound it well with a beetle until it is soft and good to work with. Have you ever hatched flax?" "No, Mrs. Bridge, I have not." "How fortunate it is that you came here before you married that poor young man!" Mrs. Bridge exclaimed. "Now watch carefully how I do this." Mrs. Bridge took a bundle of the flax, dampened it slightly, and drew it firmly across a board from the center of which stood a forest of nail-like bits of iron. These teeth separated the flax into strands, long filaments which Mrs. Bridge carefully laid to one side. "This tow that is left, the slinty substance, we do not use for thread," said Mrs. Bridge. "Now you try this bunch." "But there is so little flax from that large bunch." "It looks like very little, but it will make a great deal of thread," Mrs. Bridge assured her. "Now you hatchel this bunch." She handed a handful of flax to Greta, who started to lay it on the hatchel. "No, no, you didn't watch me. It must be dampened before you put it on. Dampened." Greta flushed. She dampened the flax and set it down. "Gently, gently. You'll ruin it if you bang it down like that. You'll have a handful of short threads and fuzz. Ease it on, ease it on." "I do wish she wouldn't say everything twice," thought Greta, as she eased the flax onto the hatchel. "Now draw it through carefully, carefully." Biting her tongue to keep it silent, Greta drew the flax across the board slowly and carefully. Not bad at all," said Mrs. Bridge. At least she varied it a little that time, thought Greta. She didn't exactly echo herself. As they worked on the flax, a voice drifted in from the street on which the house faced. "New wheels, good wheels, wheels to mend." "The wheelwright! How timely!" exclaimed Mrs. Bridge. "Go quickly, Greta, and tell him that I wish to see him." Greta hurried out and returned promptly with the man at her heels. He pulled off his cap when he saw that the lady of the house was in the yard. "Come, my good man, and look at my flax wheel. See if you can repair it." "Why does she need it repaired?" thought Greta rather crossly, as she brushed her pricked, sticky hands. "Her linen closet is filled. I wish I might hope even to have half as much." She thought longingly of Sebastian and the home they would share. Then suddenly she smiled, rather proud of herself, because she realized that she could think of Sebastian without being tempted to run away to him. "I'm really learning to be a grown woman," she assured herself. "Well, it's nice to see you so happy, you whatever your name is." Greta, who had not heard Mr. Bridge approaching, jumped a little and gasped. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. Where's Mrs. Bridge?" "Indoors with the wheelwright, sir." "Hope she finishes soon. I heard strange news today when I talked with Mr. Harding." Mr. Bridge paused and studied Greta solemnly for a moment. "You happy here, girl?" "Yes, sir." Greta was interested to realize that her answer was truthful. She had certainly not expected ever to be happy so long as she remained indentured. "Learning to be useful? To be a good housewife?" "I hope so, sir." Greta wondered what the point of this questioning might be, but then she decided that Mr. Bridge was just filling in the time until his wife should be free. As soon as the wheelwright left, Mr. Bridge went in, and when, a few moments later, Greta followed, she felt that both Mr. and Mrs. Bridge looked at her very strangely. Her conscience was clear, but she was disturbed, and when she got to bed at last, she lay awake for a long time wondering. It seemed as if the news Mr. Bridge had mentioned in some way concerned her, but she could not imagine what it might be. She knew he had talked with Father Harding about the sea captain who was to bring in indentured men, but she was already indentured. It was all very mixed up, and she was very tired. Chapter 8. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 9. Of Priests on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 9. April Storm. After the flat, rolling country of the southern part of the colony, the hills and streams of northern New Jersey were beautiful but, at the same time, trying to a horseman. There was no road to Green Pond, toward which Father Farmer was heading, so he was obliged to use trails. He meant to go to Green Pond, where there were 2 or 3 Catholic families, on to Charlottenburg, which had several more, and then take the road to Sterling, with its ironworks. He did not know how much of a flock he would find there, but he had gathered from his Philadelphia friends that many of the men were Catholics. He forded the Little Whippany River without difficulty, and the Perry Penny, or Parsippany, as some called it. Now he was on a forest trail and climbing. Sometimes, on the road, he would read his breviary as the horse jogged along, but that was not possible here. He must be constantly on the alert, lest a low branch sweep him from the saddle, or the horse stumble on a stone. He came to a little group of houses, not enough to be called a settlement, just 4 or 5 quite close together for safety's sake. He would have liked to pause to fill his water bottle, for the day had turned hot now that the sun was up, and it had been airless in the woods, but he decided against it. "I'll come to a spring or a clear stream soon," he assured himself. "There must be many in these hills." The old anti-Catholic laws were still alive to the people in this area, he had been warned. In fact, it had been suggested that he might be wise to wear Quaker garb hereabouts. Few are themselves Quakers, he had been told, but they have great respect for them. John Woolman, the Quaker anti-slavery preacher, tramped New Jersey some time ago. He met with surprising success. Many people freed their slaves. Others treated them as indentured servants, and allowed them to work out their freedom. Woolman is still remembered with honor. "I am glad he accomplished so much," Father Farmer had answered, "but I think I will not go as a Quaker. The Lord will watch over me." Though he was confident of divine assistance, he nevertheless would not run unnecessary risks. So he passed the little groups of houses and pushed on. But a well sweep he saw in the yard of one of the homes reminded him how thirsty he was. He sympathized with his horse, too. "The poor beast does all the work," he thought, "while I am carried in comfort and ease." The houses in this area, Father Farmer saw, were quite different from those around Greenwich and Cohansey Bridge. There the larger houses were of brick, often laid in such a way as to make a pleasing pattern on the outside of the house. Sometimes a soft blue-gray brick was used as well as the usual red. The priest smiled as he remembered one house he had seen where a happy bridegroom had set his initials and those of his bride in blue brick on the walls of their new house. Here the houses of the wealthier farmers were built of heavy-cut brownstone. Few were more than a story and a half high, while those in South Jersey, belonging to men of means, were often 3 stories. Here the low-side roofs were gambrel, there they were a sharp, pure Gothic. Each group of settlers brings its own love memories from the fatherland, the priest thought, and so feels at home in the new land. He suddenly became aware that his horse had stopped. Coming back to the world around him, he realized that they were standing on a sort of natural culvert. A spring which bubbled up on one side of the path had dug a passage underground, to reappear some distance away on the other side. "It's fortunate you keep your eyes open," said the priest to his horse as he slipped from the saddle. His voice startled a flicker from a nearby bush, and she flew off, complaining loudly that the place was becoming crowded, that there was no longer peace in the forest. Father Farmer led his horse down the small declivity which edged the spring. He filled his water bottle before he let his mount drink. "There now," he said, "stir up all the mud you want." The horse played for a minute in the clear coolness, snorting and blowing, dipping his muzzle and then throwing his head back as if trying to give himself a shower. Then he drank. Father Farmer did not let him have his fill, because they still had far to go. But he let him have enough to quench his thirst to some extent. The horse fussed a bit and disagreed when his rider assured him he had had enough. But finally he was persuaded, the priest remounted, and they continued on their way to Green Pond. The shadows had suddenly moved across the lane, now, and were growing long. Suddenly it was dusk. "Shall I camp here for the night?" the priest wondered. "Or am I near enough to push on?" It was well over a year since he had last been in this area, and in a year the rank growth of untouched woodlands can change the scenery in obscure old landmarks. So, although he knew he was headed in the right direction, he was unsure how much longer his trip would be. A glow crept across the sky. If the night was to be moonlight, he would keep going at least until he came to open country, for he knew that these woods sheltered panthers and wildcats, which would not hesitate to attack a sleeping man. In fact, it seemed possible that there were some near by now, for the horse, with its sharper senses, seemed to get the scent of danger. Nostrils dilated, ears flickering nervously, it minced along as if ready to shy or bolt at the first strange noise. The noise was not long in coming. An owl, ready for its nocturnal hunting trip, hoo-hooed from a nearby tree. The horse leaped convulsively, and tore down the trail in a frenzy of fear. Rocking and swaying, Father Farmer managed to keep his seat. He tried to rein in his mount and spoke soothingly to him, but, deaf with terror and insensible to the pressure of the bit in his mouth, the horse dashed on. The priest said a prayer that he would not be thrown from the saddle, and that his saddle roll with its precious contents would remain safe. They left the woods. Now the trail had widened into a lane with open fields on either side. Ahead Father Farmer could see a small, moving light. As he drew closer, he saw that the glow came from a lantern carried by a man crossing a farmyard. The horse was exhausted and over his fright, and allowed himself to be brought to a halt. "Who rides there?" called the man, "and what is the emergency?" Father Farmer patted the horse's neck, gentling and soothing him. "A traveler, Mr. Farmer from Philadelphia," he said. "There is no emergency, except in the mind of my horse. An owl's hoot frightened him in the woods, and he had the bit in his teeth before I could act." The man with the lantern walked over. Suddenly, without warning, he swung his lantern at the horse's head. The startled beast, not yet fully calmed down, reared and showed every sign of running again. Father Farmer, both hands on the reins, fought angrily for control. The man who had caused the commotion kept his lantern up and seemed to be inspecting the priest. Satisfied with what he saw, he put his lantern on the ground, stepped to the animal's head, took the reins in a firm grip, and soothed him. "I'm sorry I had to do that," he said when the flurry was over, "but I had to make sure both your hands were occupied while I looked to see if you had a musket or pistols. We do not have many night riders hereabouts, and when we do, they are not often on peaceful errands." He stroked the horse's nose, scratched his ears, and calmed him skillfully. "I hope my explanation is accepted, sir." "I understand," said Father Farmer. "I cannot have presented a welcome sight, flying out of the dark woods at this hour of night. Is there something I can do for you? Can I offer a night's shelter?" "Thank you for the offer, but I think I have not much further to go. I am looking for Jacob Watcher's house, and although I haven't been in these parts for some time, I have a feeling it should be quite near here." "Are you a relative? A close friend?" the man asked. It seemed an odd question, but, after a moment, Father Farmer decided to answer it. "I knew him long ago. I see him rarely, but am very fond of and interested in him." The man with the lantern hesitated before speaking. "Jacob Watcher is dead," he said. "A copperhead snake bit him last spring, and he had no knife with him to incise the wound." "His wife and son?" asked Father Farmer. "She had a sister in Providence Plantations, I think, and she has gone to live there. I bought this place from her. Father Farmer was at a loss. Watcher was the only name he knew in this area, although he was certain that there were other Catholic families thereabouts. He saw no way to get the information he wanted. "Let me give you shelter for the night," said the man with the lantern. "I am Matthew Savage, Mr. " "Mr. Farmer," said the priest. "I would be grateful if you would let me pasture my horse. He has had a long day, and would, I think, like to rest and have an early morning graze." "And you?" "I'll share the pasture or use a hayloft, if you have it." "You may do either, or we will welcome you to a pallet indoors, if you care for that." Father Farmer started to speak, but was interrupted. "Perhaps you'd better come in. My wife would think it most inhospitable to let you stay outdoors." As he spoke, the house door opened. "Matthew, what's keeping you? Are you all right? Has anything happened?" Matthew walked over to reassure his worried wife. Father Farmer, leading his horse, followed. Mrs. Savage, as her husband had predicted, was disturbed by the idea of a guest, even an unexpected and uninvited one, being left to sleep in the field. But Father Farmer did not like taking his saddle roll into a stranger's house, although sometimes he was obliged to, nor did he care to leave it unguarded in the open all night. So with charm and skill he finally convinced the worried lady that a night in the fine air under the high sailing moon was just what he wanted. Lying in the sweet-smelling grass, he watched his horse, freed from the saddle roll, luxuriously shake and graze for a while. Then the beast settled to sleep, and before he knew it, Father Farmer slept too. A red, threatening sunrise wakened him. Even after the sun had climbed past the rim of the hills, there was no breeze. The air was still, and the birds hushed as if they sensed trouble. There were no signs of life around the house yet, so Father Farmer snatched the few minutes of solitude to read his office. "Awake at last?" Mr. Savage's cheery voice startled the priest. "Oh, yes. I thought you were sleeping." "A farmer's day starts long before sunup. Or have you never lived on a farm?" "I've never made my home on one, but I have visited them often. I did know that a farmer's day begins early, but I suppose that sometimes exceptions might be made." "Well, this can't be one. I have a sour gum tree I want to take down, and I'm anxious to do it before we have a storm that might topple it." Seeing that he was expected to do so, Father Farmer fell into step with Mr. Savage, and they walked toward the house. Mr. Savage explained that he had a good apple orchard, and each fall, when the traveling cider press came along, he made enough cider to carry them through the winter. "But my 2 barrels have split and become useless," he said, "so I hope to get 2 new ones from the old sour gum tree. That tree, when it grows old," he went on, "starts rotting at the core. So if the tree is cut down with its trunk intact, it has only to be sawn into proper lengths. Then the rotted wood can be scraped away, and fine barrels are the result." "We had a good staver and hooper living near us once," he said, "but when Newark offered to present 6 acres of land free to any artisan who settled there, he left us to make barrels in town." There was a good rabbit stew for breakfast, and pumpkin bread to sop up the gravy. Mr. Savage drank cider, and his wife had brewed some dried herbs into a sort of thick tea. Neither appealed to their guest, who contented himself with water. Suddenly the sun, which had been pouring in the window, was shut off as if a curtain had been drawn. A low wind sprang up, whirling little clouds of dust along the ground. From the field Father Farmer heard his horse snorting in fright. "It looks like a bad storm. We have them in April and May," said Mr. Savage. "Perhaps I'd better saddle up and be on my way. I'd like to get some of the road behind me while I can." "You'd best get your horse out from under those trees and into the barn while you can," answered Mr. Savage. "I have a horse in the north field, and I'll run for him." "We lost our best horse last year when he sheltered under a tree in a tempest," explained Mrs. Savage, "and my 2 hens had their feathers singed." Mr. Savage and Father Farmer ran to get their horses. They led the animals to the barn, put each in a stall, and hurried back to the house. The heavy black clouds now hung so low they seemed to rest on the tree tops, and the thunder, far off only a few minutes ago, now was very near. The wind had risen to fury, but no rain fell. "I don't like dry storms. said Mrs. Savage as the men re-entered the house. "I'm afraid of them." "This may pass us over," said her husband, but he sounded doubtful. He had hardly finished speaking when a roar of thunder deafened them, and at the same instant the room blazed with light. That struck near by. All three people in the kitchen ran to the window. A tall sycamore tree in the field near the barn had been hit. In running down the tree to bury itself in the ground, the lightning had only charred the wood, but it had set fire to a last year's bird's nest in a branch high from the ground. Nest and branch were blazing. As they watched, a gust of wind ripped the weakened branch from the tree and hurled it, blazing, on the roof of the barn. "The horses! We must get them out!" Mr. Savage ran to the door. "Maria, you and Mr. Farmer get the horses out. I will climb to the roof of the barn and shove that branch off. If the shingles catch fire, the whole place will go." He raced out of the house to the barn. "He can't get up there. He can't climb." Mrs. Savage clutched Father Farmer's arm. "He broke his shoulder some time ago, and it's been stiff ever since. He'll hurt himself again." Father Farmer hurried to the barn. "Help your wife with the horses," he commanded brusquely. There was so much authority in his voice that Mr. Savage did not hesitate, but at once ran in to help with the plunging, terrified beasts. They were panicked by the wind and thunder, and did not understand that the stable was now more dangerous than the storming world outside. Mrs. Savage had succeeded in getting a rope halter on Father Farmer's mount, but pull and tug as she might, she could not get him out the door. "Give me the rope. You halter our horse," shouted her husband. Father Farmer, meanwhile, had swung the barn door wide. The X-beams which framed it were shallow, but he managed to get finger and toe holds and hoist himself to the top of the door. As Mr. Savage ran back to help remove his own horse from the barn, the priest called to him, "Hand up a pole of some sort." Mr. Savage snatched the long rake from the corner of the barn and put it into the reaching fingers. Carefully, Father Farmer stood balanced on the top of the swaying barn. Then, with the litheness of a cat, he leaped to the barn roof. An active life and long hours in the saddle had made him strong. Leaning a little against the wind, he inched his way along until he was within reach of the burning branch. Carefully he hooked the rake under it and sent it, a river of sparks, to the ground. A few of the shingles on which it had rested were smoldering, but not yet aflame. With rake and shoe he removed all traces of fire. It seemed to take him a long time, but it was only a few minutes before he let himself down and entered the barn. Mr. and Mrs. Savage turned blank faces toward him. "For what you did, we are grateful." Mr. Savage's voice sounded strained. "Your saddle roll fell open when we tried to move it. We found—" "Are you a Roman priest?" Mrs. Savage could hardly form the words. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 10. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 10. Snapped Cable. "You are a Roman priest?" Mr. Savage changed his wife's question into a statement. "I have seen such things as these before, so you cannot deny it." "Indeed, I would not deny it. I am humbly grateful that I am a priest." "Yet you accepted our hospitality?" "Yes, I gratefully accepted hospitality graciously offered. It was a gesture of Christian charity, and I appreciated it." "You did not tell us you were a priest." "You did not ask." Mr. Savage grunted in exasperation. "Well," he said, "now that we have uncovered your secret, you can stay here no longer." "Matthew, the storm is so bad, and our barn is here only because of the efforts of this man." Mrs. Savage was disturbed by her husband's harshness. "It is because I am mindful of that fact that I do not take sterner steps." "A little food for his journey?" Mrs. Savage said timidly. Her husband glared at her. "I am stretching a point, and doing violence to my feelings, by letting him go at all. I certainly will not try to make his journey more comfortable." "The barn would have gone, and perhaps the house." murmured Mrs. Savage, as if thinking aloud. "Be still," her husband ordered. He paused a moment. "You, sir, roll the saddle blanket with these things here, and saddle your horse. If my wife can make a little packet of food before you are ready, she may do so." It was Father Farmer's impulse to proudly refuse food so grudgingly offered, but he stopped the words before they were spoken. To show pride would do no good at all; it would not be sensible to refuse food for his journey. He was not familiar with this part of New Jersey, and did not know how far he must travel before he reached a settlement where he would be welcome. He carefully closed the saddle roll and fastened it tightly, so it would not fall open again. He bridled and saddled the horse, strapped on the roll, and mounted. He was nearly out on the road when he heard Mrs. Savage call him, and saw her hurrying across the yard in the now diminishing storm. "It is not much," she said, handing him a little package, "but it may stave off hunger for a while." Father Farmer thanked her. "I will pray for you," she said. "I cannot feel that all Papists are bad, only misguided." "I will pray for you too," Father Farmer said, smiling. He trotted off, leaving her open-mouthed. By mid-morning the storm had entirely passed. Streams filled with the rain rushed down the hillsides, tumbling over the rocks in loud excitement. Father Farmer had been climbing for some time now, and the air was unbelievably light and clear. The May atmosphere was so full of life that, when the sun finally broke through the clouds, it seemed to the priest that he could see blossoms opening into flowers, and new shoots springing out on trees. Familiar landmarks appeared, and he knew that he was nearing Charlottenburg, where a congregation of almost a dozen families would welcome him. He must stay there, he realized, at least 3 days before moving on to the Sterling Iron Works near Long Pond. The congregation was growing, he told himself, after his first day in Charlottenburg. There had been deaths since his last visit, to be sure, but there were many more babies to baptize than graves to pray over. There were several marriages, too, to be blessed. Mass, instead of being said in a secret hut in the forest, could now be celebrated on the porch of a home with the congregation kneeling openly in the yard. He dreamed of the time when Catholics would be accepted everywhere in the colony. Surely some day they would be judged as individuals instead of being regarded with fear and suspicion. As word of the priest's presence spread, more and more people from surrounding farms sent word that they wanted to see him. Whole families came on foot over hills and through woods. Fathers, mothers, children hardly able to walk, babies carried in arms. They wanted to receive the sacraments, to get a priestly blessing, to request advice and comfort. From before sunrise until after sundown, Father Farmer gave the consolations of the Church, gave his own kindness and wisdom. When it was time to move on, he was tired out. Fortunately, the stay had rested and refreshed his horse. There were sharp, treacherous hills to be ridden across before he could get to the Sterling Iron Works on the Ringwood River. He had never been to an ironworks before, and was eager to see this one. As he rode through the countryside, he noted with interest the houses he passed, happy when he saw one with roses and tulips and marigolds in the yard. There, he knew, the wife was not a household slave, but a woman who was allowed to cultivate the beauty she loved. He was interested, too, to see the increasing variety of vegetables being cultivated. Cabbages and onions had from the earliest days been large crops in New Jersey, but now he saw cauliflower, carrots, and maize grown as vegetables for the family, as well as for father for their beasts. He was happy to see many watermelon vines. It was so much better for laborers to refresh themselves during harvest with this rich, thirst-quenching fruit than to be always drinking warm beer. Little doorstep gardens of herbs reminded him of his friend Sebastian Haas. He wondered how the young man was getting on in preparing the garden for his Greta. Perhaps he would get news of them when he returned to Philadelphia. A woman, seated in front of a comfortable house, caught his attention. She was working the treadle of a potter's wheel. As the horizontal wheel spun its burden of red clay and sand, her hand skillfully brought the mass into shape. With her left hand inside the clay, she forced and smoothed the hollow center, holding and shaping and guiding it with her right hand. The task was one which required coordination and control. The clay needed firm but light handling, and, as the sides grew higher, there could be no hesitating or wavering, or the result would be misshapen and perhaps unusable. What had started out as a large wad of clay spread on the wheel was now growing hollow, taller, and taking form. It was to be a baking pot, the priest could see, and an unusually nicely shaped one. He watched in silence as the clay was worked, and spoke only when stop treadle showed that the article was finished. "Good day," said Father Farmer. "It is unusual to see a woman working a potter's wheel." "Good day," said the woman, smiling. "I must get this design on while the clay is damp." She took up a goose quill which, Father Farmer could see, was filled with a liquid clay which had been tinted blue. With assurance she fed the blue clay onto the side of the pot, outlining 2 wild roses with leaves. Carefully lifting the board on which the pot stood atop the wheel, she carried it around the house. "I will be back," she called. "This must go into the kiln which is ready for it." She was gone but a short time. "I have an order for a dozen pots and jars," she said. "That was the last of the pieces." "You help your husband in the pottery?" "My husband is dead," she answered. "As a girl I learned this art from Daniel Cox in Burlington. Now I use it to support myself and my children." "I am sorry for your loss," said the priest, "but I must say that your children are fortunate in having a mother who can take care of them so well." "They are good children," said the woman, "and deserve the best I can do for them." "Will this road take me to the ironworks?" asked the priest. "Yes, it will. As soon as you are over the crest of this hill you will come on the charcoal pits. From then on all of the buildings are connected with the mines and the works." The priest thanked her and rode on. Riding in this clear air had made him hungry, and he had hoped that he might be offered a meal at the potter's. But a woman living alone did well to be cautious about allowing strangers on her place, he knew, especially when she was outdoors and away from the musket which probably hung over the kitchen fireplace. The horse reached the hilltop, and Father Farmer reined him in, looking at the busy valley below. He saw several peculiar cone-shaped heaps, which he decided must be the charcoal pits of which the woman had spoken. As he neared the valley, 2 men left the field across the road and went toward the area containing the pits. "Good day, sirs," the priest greeted them. "I wonder if you can tell me where Mr. Torrance lives, and where I can find him." There was silence for a moment. Then one of the men answered by asking a question of his own. "And who might you be? What is your business with Patrick Torrance?" "I am Father Farmer from Philadelphia. I was told that Mr. Torrance and some of his fellow countrymen would welcome me here." The 2 men snatched their battered hats from their heads and smiled widely. "As indeed he does, Father," said the one who had spoken. "We're sorry to have seemed suspicious, but—" "Think no more of it." The priest leaned from the saddle to grasp the man's hand. "You, I gather, are the Mr. Torrance whom I was seeking. And this man?" "John Killoran, your Reverence, and I bid you 10,000 welcomes." "My house is not far from here, Father. Will you come there? It has been swept and polished until I was afraid if you did not come soon my wife would wear holes in it with her cleaning. She's a powerful woman, my wife." "You'll be welcome among many of us," said Mr. Killoran. "My boy has needed baptizing for a long time, and Thomas Crook and his wife." "Father Farmer will find out his duties for himself." Patrick Torrance hushed his talkative companion. "I must go first to the pits before I take you to my home. Would you like to see them, Father?" "I would indeed. I've never seen charcoal made." The priest dismounted, tethered his horse to a sapling beside the road, and followed the 2 men down a rutted lane. "You see, Father, the forests up here have plenty of hardwood that makes the best charcoal. We build it up after it has been cut to proper length, and make it into a cone-shaped pile with an open core down the middle. The whole thing, with the exception of the core and a few air holes at the bottom, is covered with a thick layer of dirt. What's that for? To keep the wood from flaming up and turning to ash. It must just smolder if we are to get charcoal from it." "Of course," said the priest. "I should have thought of that." "Each man to his own job," said Killoran. "I couldn't say Mass even if I could, if you get my meaning." With a look of annoyance at such a foolish interruption, Patrick Torrance went on. "We light the pile through the top opening, and the burning begins," he said. "We char 40 cords at a time. It takes a week to get it to the right condition. Then the air holes, top and bottom, are closed with earth, shutting off the air and so stopping the fire. "A fine arrangement," said the priest. "You can be about other business while the fire prepares charcoal for you." "Not at all." Patrick was shocked. "The collier must watch day and night. That's why I'm here now, to see that my watchman has not fallen asleep on the job." "Why must it be so carefully watched?" The priest was puzzled. "Because, as the wood chars, it sometimes shifts. When it does, the earth covering may cave in, and let in too much air. Then we have flame, ashes, and no charcoal." "And when the charring process is finished?" asked the priest. "The charcoal is raked out with iron-toothed rakes. Then it is hauled over for use in the smelting furnaces. Ah, Danny," Patrick broke off, "I'm glad to see you're taking no nap today." The young man grinned. "A nap? After that clap on the head you gave me when you found me sleeping before? Not likely." "Well, the reminder I gave you was nothing to what you'd have had if the dirt caved in while you slept and all the wood was destroyed," Patrick assured him. "Anyone you see, Danny, be sure you tell them the priest is at my house. They can come there to make arrangements for what is needed." Father Farmer's progress towards the Tarrant house was slow. Word of his presence spread rapidly, and the joy his presence brought was deep. Some of the workers and their wives had not seen a priest in years, and their happiness in having Father Farmer among them was almost too great for expression. "My youngest father has never been baptized," said one woman. "We've moved about a lot since we've been in this country, and we've missed the priest in every home we've had." "Is the child in the house?" Father Farmer asked. "No, there he comes now with his dad." The youngest turned out to be a lad of 15, as tall and almost as broad as his father. Father Farmer wished, not for the first time, that there were more missionaries in the colonies. These people had clung to the faith of their fathers through years of hardship, without the help of the sacraments, and with no priest to help them. But he wondered about the next generation, who had never been properly instructed, had never seen a church. Would their faith be as strong? In the days that followed he was very busy. Mass, baptism, marriage, extreme unction in one or two cases, special instruction for men who might act as catechists until the next priest came. He poured out all his strength trying to do the work of years in a few days. And each man with whom he talked was anxious to show the visitor his part in the mining and making of iron. The priest learned about the mines and saw the deep pits into which the men descended to bring up the precious ore. The platform on which they were lowered far into the depths seemed a flimsy thing on which to risk one's life. So, too, did the windlass-controlled cable on which the platform was suspended. He saw the ore brought to the blast furnace for smelting, and observed how cleverly the furnace was situated. It was on a hillside, so that the ore and charcoal could be easily fed in at the top, while the finished product was taken out from the bottom, and both operations done at ground level. Ingenuity was used, too, in the drawing off of the clear metal at the bottom of the furnace. It ran into a bed of sand called a pig bed, an area about 30 feet long and 5 to 6 feet wide. From there it moved on into sand trenches, where it hardened into bars called pig iron. Sometimes, however, instead of being made into pig iron to be sent to the forges, it was run into molds of pots, pans, and firebacks. These cast iron pieces were ready for immediate use. The forges, too, fascinated the priest. Their great bellows and fierce fires tended 24 hours a day. The hammering and shaping and working of the iron belonged to a world outside anything he had known before. He was puzzled, walking down a lane on his way to the Tarrant house one day, to see some men in a field working on what looked to him like a great seining net. "If I did not know we were in the mountains, not at the sea, I'd think you men were preparing to catch fish," he said. "We are, Father," one of the workers answered. "Is there a lake near here large enough to warrant the use of a net that size?" asked the priest. "No, we're getting it ready to use when we go to Aquaquanaut Landing in a few days." "The shad will be running in the Passock River," another broke in. "How do you use a net of this size? It must be 100 feet long." "150," said the first man. "Two of us stand on the shore holding one end of it, while two others row out in the river with the other end. Then they slowly circle back, closing the net as they come, and—" The speaker's words were drowned out by a wild clang of metal on metal. "Emergency! They're beating trouble!" The men left their seining nets, where they fell, and Father Farmer followed them as they sprinted to the mine office. He saw a man give a few final blows with a heavy hammer to an iron hoop suspended from a strong frame. "A handle of the windlass tore loose, and the men can't control it," someone told him. "We are going to see if we can stop it." The priest joined the group, running to where the windlass was spinning madly, paying out the cable which supported the platform. The speed of the cable created awful friction, and the spindle was beginning to smoke. Two misguided men tried to grab the cable. Their hands were burned to the bone. "Is there someone on the platform?" asked Father Farmer. "My husband and my son," said a woman in the crowd which had gathered. The windlass spun crazily. Suddenly there was a tearing sound. The cable pulled loose and snapped. It snaked across the ground and then disappeared down the shaft. A groan went up from the crowd. The sides of the shaft were smooth. The men could not climb out even if they were unhurt, and that seemed unlikely. It would take days to secure another cable, and in the meantime what could they do for the two men in the shaft? End of Chapter 10. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 11. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 11. The Seaning Net. "Are there ropes we could let down to them?" Father Farmer was talking with a group who were trying to work out a means of rescue. Thomas Ryan and his son had been dumped from the platform as it fell, and were clinging to a small ledge part of the way down to the first cross shaft. From shouted bulletins they learned that the man had suffered a twisted back. His son seemed to have been more seriously injured and was only half conscious. "No rope nearly long enough to reach. Could we tie two together?" "It would mean tying 4 or 5 together, and it would not be safe." "I suppose not." Silence held the room, broken only by the sound of hammering outside, as the men worked frantically to repair the windlass. "Why do they do that now?" asked the priest. "To have it ready when the riders return with the new cable. We could not pay it down and haul it up over the side of the pit. It would chafe and break." A man who had been to the shaft mouth came running to the group inside. "Ryan says he can't hold the boy much longer," he panted, "and he says the shelf they are on is beginning to crumble." Suddenly Father Farmer sprang from his chair. "How far down is the ledge they are on?" he asked. 130 or 40 feet." "The seaning net." "The what?" The men in the room were bewildered. "The seaning net. Come, we'll get it." He bounded from the room, followed by the others. More men from the group outside joined them. They did not know what was up, but they saw action and joined in as a welcome relief from helpless waiting. "We can't let it down. Doubled it won't reach," panted one of the men. "No, we'll let it down its full length. I'll climb down as if it were a rope ladder, and I can help the men climb up or carry them." "Ryan would make 2 of you." "We'll see." In an unbelievably short time the net was brought from the field. It was held by a dozen strong men at the mouth of the shaft, and Father Farmer began his cautious climb downward. He had seized the length of thin rope on his way and had it wound around his waist. The mesh was small, and he had to insert each foot cautiously. It would not do for him to fall; he might tumble the others off their ledge. Thomas Ryan, fortunately, was clear-headed. Although each move was torture, he agreed to climb the net. "But I'm not sure I can carry the boy," he said. "I'll carry him," said the priest. "You couldn't. His weight would take you off like brushing a fly from the wall," groaned Mr. Ryan. "I'll make a sling, a bag here, and sew him in with this rope I brought. You climb up while I get to work." "I think, Father, I'll see the boy fixed up first." Inch by inch in the darkness the 2 men worked the net under and around the unconscious boy. When he was comfortably enfolded, Father Farmer unwound the rope he had brought and laced it in and out, making a firm bag in which young Ryan rested. "Could you pull up the net with all 3 of us in it?" he called to the men waiting above. "Hold tight," a voice called back. "There are plenty of us here." Wedging their feet into enlarged holes in the net, clinging with tight finger holds, the The men felt the net beginning to move slowly upward. "Will the boy get banged against the sides?" someone called down. "No, there's enough netting around him to protect him," answered Father Farmer. Inch by frightening inch they ascended, as the toiling men slowly and steadily hauled the heavy net with its human burden. As Thomas Ryan neared the top, eager arms reached down to help him to earth again. Father Farmer was lifted off next. He dropped to his knees in thanksgiving. Then, tenderly and gently, the men unwrapped young Tom Ryan from his strange cocoon. "He's coming to," whispered one of them as the boy stirred. "I think perhaps he was only stunned." "Glad I was baptized this morning," the boy muttered. Soon he and his father were safely in their beds, enjoying being fussed over by Mrs. Ryan. Both, Father Farmer felt sure, would be on their feet again in a day or two. A good many people who had not attended before appeared for Mass the following morning. Very early it was evident that the little house could not hold the congregation, so the kitchen table, which served as altar, was moved into the yard, in order that all who wanted to say their thanks to God might have the opportunity. The sun's first rays, coming over the hills, illumined the host as Father Farmer elevated it. The wagon train would leave for Aquaconock Landing that day, and as soon as Mass was over there was a great stir and bustle. 60 wagons of pig iron and cast iron were loaded, and drivers and helpers bid good-bye to their families. "I know there are many Catholics in Aquaconock, Father," said Patrick Tarrant, "and they have never had Mass there." "Will it be permitted?" asked the priest. "Is there strong feeling against the Catholics?" "That I couldn't tell you, but surely some house will be glad to shelter you, even if you must say Mass in secret." "I will come, of course." Father Farmer considered the matter. "How are the roads down the colony from there?" "The best we have. You will go to Second River, and Newark, and Elizabeth." "Oh, I know the route from there very well. I will probably get back to Philadelphia sooner than if I were to go back the way I came. And even if I do not, the Catholics of Aquaconock Landing have a right to a priest." For a time Father Farmer rode beside the wagon. Patrick Tarrant drove, but, finding the conversation difficult, he tied his mount to the tail of the wagon and climbed up beside the driver. He was eager to learn what he could about the settlement to which they were going. "I'm afraid I can't tell you too much, Father," Tarrant said. "I've not often gone down so far. I usually stop with my load at the forges in Pompton and thereabouts." "What about this David Neal, who owns the wharf from which the iron will be shipped?" "He's an Irishman, but not a Catholic. I do know Thomas Singler of Aquaconock Landing, and James Farren. They are Catholics. Oh, James Morris. He's another. There are sure to be a dozen more who will be glad to see you." The road followed the Passayock River, turning and twisting as the stream wound its way through the country. They stopped for the night in a pretty little glen, and started before sunrise the next day. "The water seems to be going faster," said the priest, watching a leafy twig which had fallen into the river. "Yes, it's getting ready for its great dive over the falls," explained Patrick. "The falls?" "Haven't you heard of them? They're a wonderful sight. I wish our road went over that way, because the great cataract pouring down is something to see. I guess the drop was 100 feet. If you'd like to see it, perhaps I could take you over that way." "No, thank you," Father Farmer smiled. "I'll leave that treat for another time. This time I will stay with the wagons and get to the landing." It was toward evening that Father Farmer saw a steep hill ahead, and wondered if the tired horses would be able to haul the heavy wagons across it. But as they neared it, he saw that there was a natural passage, a cut which might have been made by glaciers thousands of years ago. "This is Great Notch," explained Patrick. "Now we'll get on to Sipp's Lane, and then we're only a few miles from the wharf." Lush farmland spread on either side of the road. Good stone houses showed that comfort had long been established. Barns were tight, cattle well kept, and a general air of well-being marked homes and farms. The road twisted and wound, but before dark they reached their journey's end. A ship was waiting to take the iron to New York foundries and forges. David Neal waited on the wharf to count the wagons in. The horses were unhitched and led across the road to fields and barns behind Mr. Neal's house. There, too, the men would spend the night in great barracks built to shelter them. Mr. Neal invited Father Farmer to sleep as a guest in his home. "I will see that any men of your faith working for me are told that you are here," he said to the guest, Will you have services for them?" The priest smiled. "Tell them that there will be Mass the day after tomorrow," he said, "and that I will be available tomorrow and for a few days to come." "This Mass you speak of," Mr. Neal said hesitantly, "is it will it bring a large number of people?" "I expect that it well may do so." "The reason I asked," Mr. Neal hastily explained, "was because I wondered if you would like to have it here in your room, or if you would need larger quarters." "Are there larger quarters any place near here?" "There is a hall in the annex of Leslie's Tavern," said Mr. Neal. "It is used for meetings and parties." "That will be fine if I can secure it. I'll see Mr. Leslie the first thing in the morning." When Father Farmer went to the tavern the next day, he found it to be a fine, sturdy building which had originally been used as the parsonage for the Dutch Reformed Church, which stood near by. When it was replaced as parsonage, it became the noon house for the congregation. To it the people would go at noon, in the middle of day-long services, to eat the lunches they had brought, and, in winter, to replace the charcoal in the little foot-warming stoves they carried. But it had now been sold to Mr. Leslie, to be used as the tavern and inn. Aquaconock Landing was growing in importance as a seaport, and accommodations were needed for merchants and travelers. Mr. Leslie was delighted to know that Mass was to be said there the following day. "Of course you'll be my guest. It will be easier for people to find you in the tavern," he said, writing down any objections Father Farmer might have made. "I'll get on my horse and go tell the people you're here. There's John Brower. He has a hot pull and barrel business. And Patrick McGovern. He has a nice little stone quarry on the other side of the hill. Oh, there are many of your flock around here, and I don't know how many indentured people besides." The flood of words had silenced Father Farmer, but he did get a question in, now. "How about yourself? Are you one of my flock?" Mr. Leslie paused a moment. "A tavern keeper, Father," he said, "has no religion, no politics, no opinions. He is just an agent to bring rest and refreshment to those seeking them. But I'll ride around spreading the word that Mass will be said in the annex tomorrow, and I might be over for it." Father Farmer walked out to see the annex. It was a long, low building with an open ground floor, where horses and wagons might be left. The second floor would become a chapel on the morrow. Aquaconock Landing, Patrick Tarrant had said, was reputed to have one of the best schools in this colony. "That's because they always have Irish schoolmasters, Father," Patrick explained. "They've learned Latin and numbers and so on in the old country. They know how to study and how to teach others to study." "Suppose they can't get an Irish teacher?" the priest asked, somewhat amused at what he believed to be Tarrant's partisanship. "They can't get any Hollanders to teach. The school was shut down for a long time before John Scanlon came." "I'd like to meet this John Scanlon," said Father Farmer. "You will, if he's able to be about. But I hear he's been sick for a month past." "Where does he live?" "Right in Leslie's Tavern." "Then I'll certainly call on him." Father Farmer did stop in, after Mr. Leslie had ridden off to round up a congregation, but John Scanlon was in a heavy sleep. And the priest had no further chance that day, for as soon as word spread that a priest was in the area, all sorts of requests came. Old people were in their last illness. Young couples could not leave farm and children, but wanted their marriage blessed. Wives wanted advice. Widows needed consolation. It was late that night before he had finished. The May sun rose on lanes filled with wagons, passed with horsemen and families afoot. The rope-drawn ferry across the Passyok River was busy bringing people across to assist at the first Mass ever said in the area. Mr. Leslie had ridden far, and each person he spoke to was asked to tell any others they knew who would want to hear Mass. Some of these people had been half a lifetime without seeing a priest, but at the first opportunity they made almost superhuman efforts to come to Mass. "The flame of faith burns bright," Father Farmer told himself, deeply moved. "Even though it has had little to feed on all this time, it still burns bright." Mothers, on the way to the tavern, had tried hastily to instruct their children and prepare them for the ceremony of Mass. The children had been taught their faith as well as their parents could manage it, but none of them had ever been to Mass before. But whether they understood what was going on or not, there was no noise in the hall. Even the smallest children seemed to sense that someone more important than they was present. As Father Farmer turned to give the last blessing, he saw his host, Mr. Leslie, standing in the doorway, and he was distracted for a moment. There was a look of strain on the man's face. The last gospel finished, Father Farmer left the trestle table which was his altar. Mr. Leslie hurried over to him. "It's John Scanlon, Father. I think you'd better go to him. He's looking very strange, and I don't like the way he's breathing." Father Farmer looked at the congregation. He knew that many of them had made great sacrifices to come to Mass, and would want to talk with him now, but they must wait. "I know that some of you want to see me," he said, turning to the congregation, "just as I want to see you, but there is a poor soul in the tavern whose need is greater than yours, and I must go to him. Those of you who must get back to work or to home duties may leave word with the others if you want me to call, and I promise that before I leave these parts I will visit each of you. Those of you who wish to wait may do so, but staying or going, in your charity say a prayer for Schoolmaster John Scanlon." Following Mr. Leslie, Father Farmer hurried down the stairs into the tavern, and up the stairs again to where John Scanlon lay. "I hope he can talk to you, Father," panted Leslie. "The poor fellow has something on his mind. I don't know what it is, but it frets him often. Perhaps you can help him." When they opened the door of the sick man's room, however, they saw at once it was too late. He had gone past human help. All they could do now was to pray for his soul. End of Chapter 11. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 12. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 12. The Little Tin Box. A large part of the congregation was still waiting when Father Farmer returned to the hall. They looked at the solemn face of the priest as he fell to his knees and began to pray. "Out of the depths I have cried unto thee, O Lord," he began. There was a rustle as the waiting people slipped from the backless benches on which they had been seated and knelt on the floor. Most of them knew the De Profundis, and realized that Father Farmer saying it meant that they had lost their schoolmaster. Two women went quietly out of the hall and over to the tavern to prepare the body for burial. When prayers for the dead were finished, Father Farmer turned his attention to the living. Candidates for baptism ranged from infants in arms to their parents and grandparents. Advice was given in matters of conscience. Some of the people just wanted to talk with the priest, to feel closer to the church they loved. He received the names of people who had had to leave, but who were anxious to see him. Then he went to the tavern. "Father Farmer," Mr. Leslie called him to a corner of the tap room, "I'd like you to go over Mr. Scanlon's things with me." "Has he a family, do you know? Is there someone to whom his possessions should be sent?" "We know nothing about him, Father. A few years ago our school was closed for want of a teacher. Then he appeared at my door one day, asking if he might work for some food and a night's lodging. Although it was a warm day, he was wearing a heavy bearskin coat, and seemed completely exhausted." "Did he never tell you where he had come from, or where he was going?" "He did not, Father. He talked much and well of many things, but never of himself." The two men moved toward the room where Scanlon lay, clothed in his best. The women had finished their task and were waiting to see if there was anything else they could do. "He will be buried tomorrow, Father?" asked one of the women. "I suppose so. You know nothing of a family or friends?" "Of his family, no. As to friends, everyone in Occoquan Landing was his friend." "Was he a Catholic, do you know?" "I don't know, nor, I think, does anyone else." "He may be buried with our family," said the other woman. "My children loved him dearly." It was arranged that the schoolmaster would be buried the next morning in the family graveyard, some distance down the river. Father Farmer and Mr. Leslie went into the room which had been his. "Had he any money, do you know?" the priest asked. "If so, we should have some others with us to decide what disposition should be made of it." "I think he had none, Father. He was paid a small sum each month, and he had his keep, of course. Often hard cash was not available, so he would take linen or leather or other goods for his pay. Then the next month he would have shoes or shirts made. When he did get money, he would save it until a ship was going to New York, and he would commission the captain to buy him a book." The two men saw a small tin box under his bed. "He carried that when he came here, and was always most careful of it," said Mr. Leslie. "I never saw what was in it, however." "Perhaps it will give us some clue as to his family and where they are. Shall we look?" "I think we must." The two men drew the little box from its hiding place and carried it to the window. It was locked, but the lock was rusty and gave under a slight pressure. The first thing they saw when they opened it was a withered rose which crumpled at a touch. Under it was a pair of silver shoe buckles, such as are worn at parties and dances. Nothing in these to tell anything about the man who had treasured them, except, perhaps, that in Ireland his life had been quite different from what it was here. But on the bottom of the box there was a newspaper clipping. "Ran away December 25th last," Father Farmer read aloud. "From John Scott of Hanover Township, Morris County, Province of New Jersey. A servant man, James Murphy, 5 feet 8 inches, pitted with smallpox, yellow hair tied behind. Served with said Scott as a schoolmaster. Had on a bearskin coat with hair buttons, light colored ratteen jacket, check shirt, leather breeches, worsted stockings and pumps. Whoever secures him shall have a 40 shillings reward. John Scott." Written across the paper in fine handwriting were the words, "John Scanlon, alias." There was silence when the priest finished reading. "What shall we do, Father?" Mr. Leslie asked finally. "I think that you should put away the box and its contents for safe keeping," the priest decided. "It might be that some day one of James Murphy's family would come seeking him." "And Mr. Scott?" "James Murphy cannot serve out the rest of his indenture now," answered Father Farmer. "I suppose it was breaking his contract that used to fret him," commented Mr. Leslie. That seemed likely. "But the people around here, do we need to—" "The people here knew and loved John Scanlon, schoolmaster. We will bury him tomorrow." A surprising number of people left their work the following day to pay their last respects to the schoolmaster. The little cortege walked behind the wagon from the tavern, down the river road and up the lane which climbed the hill to the burial plot where he was laid to rest. All of them had only kind and loving things to say of the man they had known as John Scanlon, teacher of their children. The little tin box which held the story of his life was put carefully away in Mr. Leslie's tavern. The next few days were busy ones for the priest. May had grown suddenly warm, and humidity hung over the Passyok River valley. It was hard to breathe, and moving around was a great effort. But from dawn until dark Father Farmer was working hard. The people in Aquaconock had waited long and wanted to make the most of having a priest in their midst. Once again he selected a few of those who knew their faith best and who could learn quickly. He trained them as best he could in the few days at his disposal to teach others the basic truths of the faith. "Perhaps I can ride this way again in the fall," he said. "I'll expect some fine catechism classes ready for me." After almost a week he decided he could stay no longer. Soon Father Harding would begin to worry that he had met with an accident. As he rode toward Second River, men waved to him from the fields, and children left their tasks to run to the road to shout a good-bye. He reached the busy town of Newark before midday, and stopped to visit with various families whom he knew there. To Woodbridge and Brunswick, to Princeton, Maidenhead, and at last to Trenton. It took another 2 weeks to go through the colony, stopping where he was needed, saying Mass at friendly farmhouses, sleeping in the fields and sections where Catholics were suspect. He had hoped that on this trip he might get out to Great Egg Harbor, but the stay at Aquaconock Landing had delayed him, and passage through the cedar swamps would be long and hard. As it was, May was nearly gone when he once again stopped at Patrick Colvin's house, which he reached toward evening. "This is a coincidence," said Patrick, after he had greeted the priest. "The last time I saw you was in March, the day young Sebastian Haas was on his way home to his wifeless house." "So?" "I haven't seen him since, either, until this very morning, when I ferried him over on his way to Philadelphia." "Was he any happier than he was the last time we saw him?" "Happier? Patrick considered the matter a moment. "No, I couldn't say he was happy exactly, but at least he was not rebellious. He had the air of a man with a job to do, and if he didn't much like the job, at least he was going to do it. I'm glad he has accepted life," the priest said. "It will be easier for him, and he'll get more done, too. He had a fine load of pelts he was bringing in to sell. All three brothers are working at it, and between them there'll not be an animal left in the colony before long. I suppose he has a market for them." Patrick Colvin's eyes twinkled. "Indeed he has, and he won't mind a bit delivering the skins." The priest looked questioningly at Patrick. It seems that some weeks ago a Philadelphia man was out buying skins for his tannery. By chance he stopped at the Haas home, or it seemed to them by chance, and inquired if they had skins for sale. And do you know who the man was? Father Farmer knew that no answer was expected, so he waited quietly for Patrick to continue. It was a Mr. Bridge. "The man who—" "The same. The one to whom Sebastian's Greta is indentured." Patrick paused to let the import of this coincidence sink in. "He made himself very friendly with the three brothers, and when he was leaving told them that he'd take all the good skins they could bring in. He's a good man, Father. Shrewd, gruff sometimes, but good." In the morning Patrick took the priest across the river to Pennsylvania. The horse was less fractious than he had been on the trip up, over 2 months before, less eager in covering the miles. It was good that he would have a long rest before the long fall journey came. After the hills and valleys and farmlands of New Jersey, the city seemed hot and noisy to Father Farmer. Heavy farm carts rattled and rumbled over the streets. 4-horse coaches dashed by at great speed. Private carriages demanded right of way. There must be several hundred families all within a few square miles. Father Farmer was glad to reach the Peace of St. Joseph's. He reported on his trip to Father Harding, and they wondered if it would not be possible to get a missionary from Europe to come to live in New Jersey. "The Catholic population is growing all the time," said Father Farmer. "There must be several scores of them in the northern part of the colony alone." "I know," sighed the other priest. "This colony has worried us for a long time. Some years ago, before the Indians were moved to Brotherton, a Dr. Nicholas Roach from New York went over to Aquaconock Township to instruct them. He lived with a family at a place called Westbrook. Through a friendly interpreter, he taught the Indians, and he did what he could to instruct the colonists too. The Indians have been moved away, and Dr. Roach is dead. What remains of his teachings among the colonies no one knows." The two priests sat in silence for a while, brooding on the problem and trying to think of a possible solution. "We must pray for more men to come," said Father Harding at last, "and we must be grateful for your youth and strength, for my days are running out." It was true, Father Farmer noticed with a start. The older priest had failed a great deal, even in the short time his assistant had been gone. He, Father Farmer, must try to spare his superior all he could, to carry even more of the ever-growing load. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 13. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 13. Sebastian. The wheel used for spinning flax was quite different from the wool wheel which Greta had used at home. But once she had become accustomed to it, she liked working on the linen thread. Since the weaver was due to make his annual visit soon, the spinning wheel hummed from morning to night, so that plenty of thread would be ready for him. "When the weaver comes," said Mrs. Bridge, "I will want you to learn from him how to use the loom." There were so many things Mrs. Bridge wanted Greta to learn. At first the girl had been inclined to resent the many new duties and lessons, but then, remembering Father Harding's advice, she saw that all this knowledge would be useful and important when the years of her indenture were over and she was mistress of her own home. She had given up any notion of running away, of cheating the Bridges of something for which they had paid. She had learned, too, the further truth of the priest's suggestion that if she asked permission she would be allowed to go to Mass, not only on Sunday, but sometimes during the week she was able, after she had finished her early morning duties and before the family was stirring, to hurry to St. Joseph's. If the household could not understand why on occasion she went out without breakfast, they accepted her odd ideas. So while natural disappointments still lingered, while she was not happy in her circumstances, she was not unhappy either. It was sort of a waiting period between the end of her old life and the beginning of the new one. Very sensibly she made the most of it. Busy days came when Mr. Bridge prepared to go to New York Colony to get skins from the Indians for use in his tannery. He had sent up to Bergen County in New Jersey to buy wampum from an expert maker there. Greta was delighted with the look of it. "It's so much prettier than money," she said, fingering the black discs cut from clam shells, and the less valuable ones made from many different shells. "And this lovely little thing, it looks like a fairy pipe." "It is a pipe," Mr. Bridge explained, "of a kind the Indians treasure greatly." "I should think if one burned tobacco in it, it would fall apart. It looks as if it were made of, well, not clay, anyway." Mr. Bridge laughed. "It's not made of clay. It's the core of a large conch shell, with the end carefully cut out from the end of the shell, and it's not used for smoking. As you see, it has no real bowl for tobacco." "But what is it used for?" "Indians run locks of their hair through such pipes when they are dressing for ceremonial occasions. Or sometimes they wear them on thongs of leather as necklaces." "Mr. Bridge," said his wife, "you are delaying Greta, who has work to do. Those stockings are still to be ravelled, Greta." Greta set to work, but with no feeling of rebellion. She had learned all she wanted to know about wampum, and there was work to be done. The torn, worn stockings she was ravelling would produce wool yarn, which, with additions, would be dyed and woven into a coverlid for a bed. "Plants in this country are quite different from the ones you are accustomed to, Greta. You must learn about them." "It almost seems, when Mrs. Bridge says things like that," Greta sometimes thought, "as if she were laughing at some private joke." But then Greta would make some foolish mistake, and all thought of jokes, private or otherwise, would quickly vanish. Yet, somehow, it seemed to her that ever since the day the wheelwright had come, the day Mr. Bridge spoke so mysteriously of something he had learned, there had been knowledge in the house which concerned her, but of which she was not told. Mr. Bridge was taking 2 of his indentured men from the tannery with him. One was going because he was an excellent judge of skins, and knew the working and cutting of leather. The other was going largely because he was quick and accurate with his pistol. "You see, Greta, while Mr. Bridge will do most of his buying with wampum, he will also carry a bag of hard cash. Wampum, of course, has a set value, too." The thought of a whole bag of hard cash made Greta gasp. Many colonists lived out their entire lives without ever having seen any. Trading of goods and services was the usual medium of exchange. The weaver kept a certain amount of cloth for himself from each lot he wove. Lengths were traded for food, candles, or perhaps a jackknife. There were few inns where a night's lodging could not be had in exchange for jackknife-carved spoons or bowls. At the inn he might meet a leather man and trade cloth for enough leather for a pair of boots. Then, at the next town, he would weave for the bootmaker's wife in exchange for the work on his leather. Only the very rich, the men of importance in business, used hard cash, and Mr. Bridge was going on the high road carrying a bag of it. Greta decided that she must pray very hard for his safe return. A large part of the city of Philadelphia was busy discussing a matter of which it knew very little, and, as usual, the less informed people were, the more willing they were to give information. Mrs. Bridge and Greta, busy now at a quilting frame, did not know, and knew they did not know. "I would like to understand what the transit of Venus is." "It sounds not quite respectable to me, Greta," said Mrs. Bridge briskly. "Oh, it is respectable, Mrs. Bridge. It's ever learned." "Then the less you know about it, the better. Gentlemen do not like ladies to have learning." Greta sewed in silence, reaching in toward the center of the quilt where the pattern led her. She still felt she would like to know who Venus was, and what a transit might be, but since her curiosity was not shared by Mrs. Bridge, she was wise enough to let the matter drop. But a few days later, as she hurried on an errand for Mrs. Bridge, she met Father Harding going the same direction. "You see a happy man," he said, after they had exchanged greetings. "I am going to meet some members of the American Philosophical Society." "What is that, Father?" "It is a group of men, the only one of its kind in the New World, who are interested in the sciences." "What are sciences, Father?" For a moment the priest seemed to wish he had limited his talk to housekeeping. But then, good-humoredly, he tried to explain. Scientists, Greta, are men who study the stars, who learn about plants and flowers, who experiment with, for instance, electricity. And what do you do in the society, Father? Oh, I am not a member, although I did study about many of those things in the old country, and Father Farmer is well known in Europe as an astronomer. A Catholic priest would not be welcome in the group. But my friend, David Rittenhouse, has invited me to his home to meet some of the men who are helping to prepare to study the transit of Venus next year. Father! Greta stopped short and fixed the priest steadily with his eyes. Who is Venus, and why is everyone interested in seeing her transit? Is she a lady? The name sounds like one. How, wondered Father Harding, do you answer a question like that when there was no background of knowledge to build on? But he did the best he could, and wondered, when he and Greta parted at the end of the lane, how good that best had been. Greta finished her errand and hurried home. She could hardly wait to explain to Mrs. Bridge what the transit of Venus was. Venus is a star. The world is a star, too. How silly, Greta! Mrs. Bridge was sharp. Stars are up in the air, and they shine. The earth is down here, and it certainly has no shine to it. Well, perhaps they are planets. Father Harding did say that name. Perhaps. Since Mrs. Bridge had no idea what a planet might be, she was more willing to accept that identification. Well, Venus is nearer the sun than we are, and so next year, when it passes the face of the sun, men want to measure it. Measure it? Measure what? How long it takes to cross the sun. What good will that do them? I don't quite understand that part, Greta admitted, but I know it is very important. Men all over the world will be watching, and when they asked for help from this side of the world, our own Mr. Rittenhouse, here in Philadelphia, was the only man who had the knowledge and the instruments to help. Mrs. Bridge sewed in silence for an interval. I always said that Philadelphians were fine people, she said complacently, breaking the silence at last. Perhaps sometime you will ask Mr. Harding just why the men want to measure how long this Venus takes to cross the sun, although you must tell only me about it. As I have told you, gentlemen do not like women to be interested in things outside the household. Neither Greta nor Mrs. Bridge understood any more after the girl tried again to have Father Harding explain the matter. Neither knew anything at all about mathematics or any of the sciences. But they did have the sense of contented satisfaction that Philadelphia was the only town in all the colonies which had a man who could cooperate with the rest of the world in this project. They didn't know what it was all about, but they realized that it was important. Early in May, Mr. Bridge returned. His trip had been successful in every way. He had hides for making coats and shoes and harnesses, and a specially good one from which a fire bucket would be made for his own household. With the city growing so fast, there were hundreds of houses now, and many of them quite close together. Fire was an increasing hazard. It was necessary that every householder be represented by a man with a sound, watertight bucket in the firefighting bucket brigade. "I got some good skins in New Jersey," he told Greta the morning after he returned. "A particularly good bearskin came from a young man who was a very shrewd bargainer." Greta was busy cleaning candle-stands, and since no comment seemed needed, she made none. "I thought you'd be more interested, Greta." Mr. Bridge sounded irritated. "You don't even ask for the health of your Sebastian." "Sebastian!" The candle-stand went over with a clatter, and the droplets of grease, which Greta had been collecting for reusing, flew in all directions. "Did you see Sebastian?" "I just told you. I bought a good bearskin from him, and found him a young man who could dicker well." "How is he? How does he look?" "He seems well. He looks, to me at least, like any other young man. You may be seeing him before long, as I have business to discuss with him." "Sebastian coming here? Are the candle-stands done, Greta?" Mrs. Bridge had entered the kitchen without being noticed by Greta, so excited was she about the possibility of seeing Sebastian soon. What business could Mr. Bridge have with Sebastian, Greta wondered, and what was the meaning of the strange exchange of glances between Mr. and Mrs. Bridge? It was like the day the wheelwright had come. Greta flew at her work with violence, the rest of the day trying to keep herself so occupied with her duties that she wouldn't have time to wonder about Sebastian, to puzzle about the mystery which seemed to be growing, but in spite of her efforts she couldn't keep her mind entirely off the matter. She gathered that Sebastian had gone to Mr. Bridges' tannery with a load of skins. Was he to stop here on the way back? She wanted to know, but could not ask, because both her employers seemed deep in some problem of their own. In the strange way time often behaves, the afternoon seemed both to drag and to fly at one and the same time. Evening came, and the candles were lighted. Greta took up her sewing. Mr. and Mrs. Bridge sat and did nothing, which made the strange situation even more strange. There was a knock on the door. "The young man you sent to the tannery is here, Mr. Bridge," said the servant who answered the knock. "Do you want to see him?" Mrs. Bridge shook her head, but her husband spoke. "Yes, show him in." He turned to his wife. "I must, my dear. In simple justice, I must tell the story." End of Chapter 13. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 14. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 14. Come and bring your wisdom. A messenger knocked on the door of the priest's house. Father Farmer, not yet retired, hurried to answer it before it roused his old pastor. "Mr. Harding?" asked the man who stood outside. "He is sleeping. I am Father Farmer. Is there something I could do for you?" "Well, I don't know." The messenger was hesitant. "Mr. Bridge sent me to ask Mr. Harding if he would be kind enough to come to the Bridge house and bring some wisdom with him." There was a pause. "He really didn't say that about being kind enough. I put that in myself," the man added. "He did say the part about bringing wisdom. I told him I didn't understand just what he meant, and he said I didn't need to. Mr. Harding would, and that's all that would be necessary." Father Farmer smiled. "Mr. Harding is sleeping. He is not very well. Perhaps I could go with you." The night was soft and fragrant. Father Farmer enjoyed walking through the dark streets beside his lantern-carrying escort. "Mr. Bridge gave you no hint as to why he wanted Mr. Harding to come and bring his wisdom?" asked the priest, smiling to himself at the odd phrase. "No, sir. The young man came back from the tannery, and instead of paying him at the door, Mr. Bridge invited him into the parlor where Mrs. Bridge was. Greta was there too. Then Mr. Bridge called me, and from the door I could peek into the room." "And what did you see when you peeked in?" "Mrs. Bridge, and the young man who came back from the tannery, and Greta. They were all as stiff and unmoving as the chairs they sat in, and no one was saying a word." Father Farmer could, as a result of his conversation with Patrick Colvin, identify the young man who came back from the tannery as Sebastian Haas. He supposed that the Bridges had kindly arranged for him to see Greta, and that they were acting as chaperones during the call. But why Father Harding had been summoned, or what his wisdom was to contribute, Father Farmer could not imagine. He hoped, however, that his own wisdom would be equal to the occasion, whatever it might be. When they reached the house, Father Farmer introduced himself to Mr. Bridge, and was in turn introduced to Mrs. Bridge and Greta. Sebastian welcomed him warmly. For a moment there was no further talk. No one seemed quite to know how to begin. Finally the priest, feeling that silence would produce nothing but more silence, opened the conversation. "I understand that you felt Father Harding could assist you in some way, with advice or counsel, perhaps. He is old, as you know, and not well. Since he was asleep when the messenger arrived, I came in his place, hoping that I might be of aid. Greta has talked with Mr. Harding a few times, and received very helpful suggestions from him," said Mrs. Bridge. "We thought that, perhaps—" "We find ourselves in a peculiar situation, Mr. Farmer," broke in her husband. "We all want to do what is right, but we don't know what that is." Another silence settled on the room, broken this time by Sebastian. "You remember when I met you in March, Father Farmer. I was very unhappy. I had gone to Philadelphia to meet my bride, but the captain insisted she had paid only half her fare, and I had no money to make up what he claimed was due him." "So Mr. Bridge paid it," said Greta, speaking for the first time, "and I was indentured to him for 5 years." "But you should not have been, Greta," Sebastian burst out. "But I am, Sebastian." Greta was firm. Father Farmer, completely at sea, looked bewildered. Then he turned to Mr. Bridge to see if enlightenment might come from there. "It was this way, Mr. Farmer." Mr. Bridge looked at the others in the room, demanding silence. "The captain of the ship on which Greta came is a rascal. For a long time he has been taking passage money from immigrants before they sailed, and demanding more when they got here. When they were unable to pay more, as most of them were, he bound them out as indentures, thus making a second profit on the passenger." A grunt of annoyance and disgust escaped the priest's lips. "The man got rich, and as he grew wealthy he grew more greedy. He decided to work the same scheme in goods, collecting from both shipper and receiver. But now things were different." "In what way?" "He was not dealing with frightened, homesick people, most of them young, who were strangers in a new, unknown land. He was dealing with business men, most of whom were as well aware of the value of money as he was. I had heard rumors through Mr. Harding some time ago, and wondered, if they proved true, how we would be affected. And they were proved true, but the man escaped before he could be jailed, and took his evil money with him. But he has left behind him a score of difficult problems to be solved. Greta had paid her fare, so the captain had no right to demand more. She should not have been indentured." Sebastian was even more heated than he had before. "He did demand it, and Mr. Bridge paid it. To go away now would be like stealing from him." Greta was almost in tears. "Don't you want to marry me? I've been fixing such a nice garden for you. Don't you even want to see the garden?" "Of course I do." Greta was really crying now. "What is your opinion, Mr. Bridge?" asked Father Farmer. "I called the young people here and told them of the situation. They would not have known of it otherwise," was the answer. "I have planted herbs and salads," said Sebastian, "and in the corner I even have flowers for you. Mary's gold, Our Lady's slipper, a little garden that prays." "Greta is learning to be a good housewife," put in Mrs. Bridge. Father Farmer felt as if his head was spinning. It was a problem, he felt, in which any decision would be wrong, because everyone had some right on his side. He did wish that Father Farming had not gone to bed quite so early. Suddenly he realized that Mrs. Bridge was speaking to him. "So what would be your idea of a just and right decision?" Father Farmer considered the matter. "What do you feel should be done?" he countered. "I think that Greta must make the decision," Mr. Bridge said. "We are fond of Greta, and she is learning very quickly," said Mrs. Bridge when the priest turned to her. "But she must decide whether to go or stay." "Sebastian?" "She must marry me and come home at once. The house is ready, my brothers are waiting, and I want her to come." Sebastian left no doubt about his feelings. Last of all, Father Farmer turned to the person most closely concerned. "Greta, how do you solve the problem?" Poor Greta twisted her kerchief in her hands, squirmed in her chair, and looked from one to the other with tear-filled eyes. "I don't know. Oh, I don't know what is right." Suddenly she straightened and spoke more firmly. "Yes, I do. I should stay here. Mr. Bridge did not know the captain was lying. He paid the money in good faith. And Mrs. Bridge has no one to help in the house since Selma ran away. I'll stay and serve out my indenture." 5 years! Sebastian could hardly believe that Greta was really deliberately putting off their wedding. "Yes." Greta's eyes flashed. "And don't you dare say I don't want to marry you, because I do. But right is right." Mr. Bridge's eyes twinkled. "May I make a suggestion?" he asked. "Perhaps we could say a year, if my wife can find another girl by then." "But the money you paid?" "Perhaps Sebastian will take on that debt. How would it be if he agrees that all skins he takes for the next 2 years belong to you, Mr. Bridge?" asked Father Farmer. Mr. Bridge was about to protest, but reconsidered. Greta had set her young man a fine example in accepting her obligation. He should be encouraged to do as well. Sebastian agreed. "Well, that seems to close the matter," said Father Farmer. He rose to go. He had not realized how tired he was until now. "You seem very weary, Mr. Farmer. said Mrs. Bridge. "I am, rather," agreed the priest. "I have just finished writing a circuit of the New Jersey colony. It was a long but satisfactory trip." He walked toward the door, but just before leaving the room he stopped. He drew a little book from his pocket and rifled the pages. "Let me see," he murmured. "I will ride the circuit next spring again. I shall be back about this same time, so I'll list an appointment on my return." He glanced at Sebastian and Greta. "Do you want to select the date for your wedding now?" Laughing, he went out of the house and back to his bare little room. He must be rested for tomorrow. There would be much to be done, he was sure. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Maria Therese. Epilogue. A Priest on Horseback. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. By Eva K. BETZ. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Epilogue. Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786. In St. Joseph's Church in Philadelphia, the body of Father Farmer lies. Few of the people who pass by know of the great man who is buried there. Just why he changed his name from Steinmeier to Farmer is not certain. Some accounts say it had to do with an inheritance, and was done when he entered the Jesuits in 1743. Others maintain that the change was made when he came to this country for the comfort of the people among whom he was to work. Whatever the reason, he was called Father Farmer when he arrived as a missionary in 1752. Some of his professors in the seminary thought that he should not be sent to the missions, certainly not to China, where he wanted to go. He had a brilliant mind, particularly in philosophy and astronomy, and they felt the order could use him at home. But he felt very strongly the call to preach the word of God in foreign lands, and was permitted to answer that call. From 1752 to 1758, his headquarters were in Lancaster, where he worked with Father, later Bishop John Carroll. At the end of those 6 years he was sent to Philadelphia, a move which delighted him for many reasons. First, it brought him nearer New Jersey, a large colony into which many Catholics were immigrating, and which had no priest. Secondly, Philadelphia was a center of intellectual stir and life, and Father Farmer had by no means left his brains behind in Europe. So his assignment was one which allowed him to exercise his missionary zeal to the fullest, and at the same time gave him the opportunity to keep his mind sharp and polished. Philadelphia in no way welcomed Catholics, but they were not so repressed there as in neighboring New Jersey. New Jersey, on the other hand, was not so bitter as New York. Each time Father Farmer went across the river from Bergen County, or by boat from Elizabeth in New Jersey to New York, he risked his life. But he made the trip several times, going and coming under the cover of darkness, baptizing, hearing confessions, marrying people, in conditions like those of the early Christians in the catacombs. A writer of Father Farmer's times describes him as of slender form, having a countenance mild, gentle, and bearing an expression almost seraphic. Yet, for all his outward mildness, within him a white-hot flame burned a consuming love of God, which made him willing to run all risks, a flame which enkindled those whom he instructed. When at last New York City could have a parish church, Father Farmer established the parish. The trails of New Jersey were long and tortuous, but he never found them too long or too wearying. And if on his way up or down the colony he heard of a single Catholic family he had not yet visited, he would go many miles out of his way to call on them. The outbreak of the Revolution made his work even more difficult. General Howe's army occupied Philadelphia from September 27, 1777, to June 1778. In that army were many English, Irish, and German Catholics, all of whom became the temporary children of Father Farmer in addition to his already large flock. It was a superhuman task which faced the priest, but his slender form never bent beneath the load. He worked on tirelessly. When the war was over, there was a lessening in the anti-Catholic feelings in the colonies become states. The abatement was slight, it is true, but it was there none the less, helped to some degree by the letter in which George Washington thanked the Catholics for their part in the Revolution, and expressed the hope that their fellow citizens would never forget their contribution. Over the years Father Farmer had written a few articles for scholarly journals, and had corresponded with students, particularly astronomers, in various parts of the world. His name became known among scholars, first abroad and then in the United States. In 1779 he was appointed to serve on the board of trustees of the University of Pennsylvania, an amazing tribute to a Catholic priest in those days. With all these activities he never lost sight of his vocation as a missioner. Philadelphia had a second Catholic church now, St. Mary's. It was in St. Mary's in 1786 that Father Farmer's funeral mass was said. He died after a short illness following a trip to New York. The newer, larger church was needed to hold the many, many mourners who wanted to attend the services. But his burial was in Old St. Joseph's, the little Gothic chapel from which he had served so many for so long. End of Epilogue. Recording by Maria Therese. End of Priest on Horseback, Father Farmer, 1720 to 1786, by Eva K. BETZ.